Welcome to Guitar Maintenance 101. I'm your host, Mike Robichaux, coming to you from the great city of Toronto, Ontario. The next couple of hours, we're going to talk about everything related to guitar maintenance, guitar setup, restringing, all the basics of guitar ownership. We're going to answer all the questions that were asked on Facebook and ahead of time, and any questions that you ask here today. Please ask questions. That's the way you will get the most out of this. I do have a plan, but I look forward to being asked and talking, as I'm good at doing. Before we go too far, I just want to acknowledge that this is the first live cast and the first video that we're putting out from our new Long McQuade video studio here at our mothership in Pickering, Ontario. A lot of work's gone into getting this room all wired up and getting it to look good. So I'm really excited and honored to get to do the first video from here. This is going to be great. Before we dive in, just a real quick rundown of what we're going to be covering, so you have some idea of what to expect. I know we've got a lot of people watching, so there's going to be a wide breadth of experience. I know we've got absolute beginners. I know we've got people who know quite a bit, and probably people that could even tell me a few things I don't know. So I want to make this appeal to everybody. We're going to start with the real basics. We're going to unbox a brand new guitar. We're going to show you all the things that you should check out, all the things you should know, the basics of guitar ownership, basic information that every guitar player needs to know to take proper care of their instrument. For some of you more experienced people, this will be stuff you've heard before, but I'll try and tell some stories. I'll try and bring some interesting facts that maybe you didn't know into it to try and keep the basic stuff interesting, even for people who have already heard it before. After we go through that, though, quickly, I really want to move into setups, as that is really the heart of guitar maintenance and getting started on working your own guitars. We're going to talk about the theory, what is a setup, everything about how it works, why setup matters, why you need it, and how to do some adjustments on your own. We'll go through all that. I'm going to talk for a while about strings, how they affect the instrument's performance, different types of strings, some of the history of how strings were built. We've got a lot of questions about that. We'll certainly talk about restringing, how to properly restring your guitar, how to know when it's time to change strings, stuff like that, how to select the correct strings. We'll talk about proper cleaning of guitars, and we're going to have to talk for quite a while about intonation, I think, because there's quite a few questions asked online about intonation, so we'll do a little bit of a deep dive more towards the end. We'll look at some common issues. I've brought about 10 guitars with me today. Most of them are working fine, but a few of them do have problems that we're going to solve and resolve together. So that's the basic rundown of what I got planned for you here today. Lots of questions to answer. I've got everything that was asked on Facebook ahead of time. We've got printed out here. Should be able to answer every question that was asked in the stuff that I have prepared. So if you asked a question ahead of time, don't worry. I've hopefully got the answer in our itinerary here. Okay, so that's the basics of what we're going to talk about here. I think we can probably just get started. Let's unbox a brand new guitar. I'm going to start with the surprise here. This is the only one I haven't checked out. Hopefully we're going to open this up and find a guitar that's in pretty good working order. Brought most of my tools with me from my usual repair shop in downtown Toronto. Might take me a little longer than usual to find stuff. My toolbox is a little unorganized. Okay, so this is a brand new Epiphone DR100. Just pulled it out of the warehouse. This is exactly what you'd be receiving if you order a guitar online or curbside pickup through one of our stores, as a lot of people are doing right now. Normally, we're real big when you buy a guitar in person at the store. We're real big on getting it out with you while you're in the store, tuning it up, checking it over, making sure that the guitar is working properly for you and that it's going to suit your needs and that everything's functional on the guitar. Something we can't really do for you when we're shipping it through a courier or dropping it off on your doorstep. So I'm going to show you everything that we would normally do in the store and everything I would do if I was getting a new guitar delivered to me. All right, so removing it from the box is fairly straightforward. You always do get a little bit of what we usually call case candy. I guess it's box candy in this case. Good not to throw any of that stuff out right away. Manuals, information about warranty, guarantees. Sometimes they give you a few extra goodies. All right. So carefully, we're going to take all the packaging off of this. This is an inexpensive guitar, entry level, so it doesn't come with a case or a bag or anything. It's just shipped to us straight from the factory, in this case in China, in a box wrapped in a few layers of plastic with just very thin styrofoam film. So before we go any further, the first thing we do want to do is check over the guitar and make sure it hasn't suffered any shipping damage or any sort of environmental damage in the time since it was packed up at the factory, since it's not shipping in a case of any kind. Okay. So on an acoustic guitar, most of this carries over to an electric guitar as well. We're just going to first look at some common areas of structural fault that you want to inspect anytime you're getting a new guitar in your hands for the first time. So the first thing, before we even tune it up, before we do anything, is just to give the guitar a quick visual inspection and make sure that it hasn't failed structurally at any of the key points. The key points on most guitars are right here on the back of the headstock. And all I'm looking for is something that would be very obvious, a crack or any kind of break or rupture on the headstock. Because of the angle, it's very susceptible to getting broken if it falls backwards like this and the headstock gets impacted on something. And that can even happen when it's in a cardboard box. If the box happens to tip over somewhere in the warehouse, something like that, just the impact of falling backwards can be enough to crack the back of the headstock here. That'll be something very obvious. These aren't fine little things we're looking out for. It'll be very obvious. Another common failure point you see in acoustic guitars is in the back of the heel here. This should be totally smooth. There shouldn't be any kind of separation or anything like that. You shouldn't see any sort of cracking, any sort of separation here. It's another common place you want to check. And then lastly, the last place to check on any acoustic guitar is the bridge, to make sure that the bridge is still properly glued, properly seated on the top. The string tension, even if the guitar isn't tuned up to pitch, the string tension, even at below concert pitch, the strings are pulling on the bridge, and they're really trying to pull the bridge off of the guitar. So it's a fairly common failure point on acoustic guitars to have the bridge come off on the back. So what you want to do anytime you're getting a new guitar, inspecting it, is just look along the back here along this glue seam and make sure that there's no gap. It should be glued firmly on the body. You shouldn't be able to slide a piece of paper under there or anything like that. It should be firmly glued on the back. So again, those are three places you want to check: the neck joint, the back of the headstock, and on an acoustic guitar, the bridge. Those are sort of the three most common failure points that we see, and I recommend inspecting them before you even tune the guitar up to pitch, because if they're starting to crack, bringing it up to pitch will only make a bad situation worse. And again, these are super obvious things. We're not looking for fine little hairlines or anything like that. These would just be obvious places where we see shipping damage. And then obviously anything else, just use your common sense. If you see obvious impact damages, holes, cracks, separation, anything like that, that's going to qualify too. So after a quick visual inspection to basically make sure the guitar looks like it's survived the trip to us without actually getting impacted, we're going to tune it up to pitch. Okay, so this guitar wasn't too far off concert pitch. It was only not even a half step down. But once you brought it up to concert pitch, once you've put all of the tension on the strings and it's now up to the proper playing tension, it's worth just checking all those same points I mentioned again. Sometimes a gap won't show itself obviously until you put tension on it and it starts to pull all of those joints open a little bit more. So now with it under proper tension, just give it that one last visual inspection one more time. So at this point, if you've got this guitar under tension, it's up at concert pitch, and you're not seeing any obvious gaps, separations, anything where your guitar looks like it's starting to pull itself apart, then you've probably got a guitar that survived shipping damage and has arrived to you in good shape and in good quality. Okay, so now that's the basic integrity of the guitar in terms of the glue joints, the actual structural construction, the cabinetry of the guitar. There's another element that we have to talk about though, and that's humidity, and whether or not the guitar has been kept in the proper environment and it's been properly humidified. Wood absorbs and releases moisture into the air around this. And so it's very important that a wooden guitar, whether it's an acoustic guitar or an electric guitar, pretty much any guitar outside of a carbon fiber guitar or something that's entirely made of synthetic material, if it's made out of wood, the guitar is going to be affected by the climate around it. The wood's going to swell up in the summertime when it's really hot and humid, and it's going to contract and it's going to shrink in the wintertime. And this can have major effects on the guitar's performance, as we're going to talk about as we get into it a little more later on. But humidity is a very important concept for everyone to understand right off the bat. So when we're inspecting a new guitar, we do want to check and make sure that it's not showing any signs of humidity-related damage. I'll kind of give you a few of the most basic things to look out for. We'll probably talk a little bit more about how humidity affects wood as time goes on. But I want to give you a few of the basic things to check for when you first open a new guitar. So one thing to check for, one of the probably the most common telltale signs that customers notice that you don't need much of a refined eye to notice, is the fret ends. This is a telltale sign of a guitar that's been dried out. Is if you'll notice, if you run your fingers along the fingerboard, generally speaking, the edge of the fretboard should feel pretty smooth. You can of course feel the frets, but they should just feel like bumps that are on top of the fretboard. They shouldn't be coming out the side. They shouldn't feel sharp. There shouldn't be it shouldn't be an unpleasant feeling. Enough that your fingers can register that they're there, but not so much that it feels like you have sharp metal sticking out the end of your fingerboard. So you want to check for that to make sure that your frets aren't sticking out over the end of the fingerboard. What's happening, by the way, when you get sharp fret edges is that your fingerboard releases moisture, it gets dried out, and it shrinks a little bit. So the fingerboard contracts a little bit, like any piece of wood, when it gets dried out. But of course, the metal frets don't. They stay the same size. They're not affected by humidity going up and down. So the frets stay the same size, and the fingerboard shrinks around it. So the result is that you have fret edges, the ends of the frets are actually sticking out a little further because now the fingerboard is narrower than the frets themselves are. So as you run your fingers along the edge of the fingerboard, you'll be able to feel them sticking out, and they'll be very sharp. It's very noticeable right away, sort of thing. And indeed, it can get bad enough sometimes that we've even had customers who have actually cut themselves on sharp fret edges. So again, this is something that you want to check out anytime you're getting your hands on a new guitar, whether it's delivered to you, whether it's in the store, whether it's a used guitar that you're buying off of anybody, whether it's your old guitar that you're pulling out of the closet for the first time in 10 years. This is something you want to look for, is does it have sharp fret edges? It's a sign that the fingerboard has shrunk. And actually, that's one thing that we did get a question about, was a guitar that, a Taylor guitar, that customers had for quite some years, and they are starting to notice that their fingerboard has shrunk a little bit, and they're noticing that they can feel those fret edges sticking out, and they're a little bit sharp on their Taylor. And this customer is very clear that they know that the guitar hasn't been dried out. They've taken all the proper steps to make sure that it's been properly humidified, but they're still noticing a little bit of this phenomenon. So I should say, it is possible for this to happen over many years, even on a guitar that is properly cared for, even if the wood's never really been dried out. Wood is a natural material. It's a dead tree. We don't have total control over exactly what it will do every single time. It's an amazing building material. It has all sorts of amazing properties, but it is unpredictable. It's a natural building material. So sometimes, and especially over years, you can start to get some bit of shrinkage in the wood, a little bit of movement, even if the guitar is properly humidified. So after you've checked for the sharp fret edges, the next thing you want to do, and this is something you can just inspect visually on an acoustic guitar, and this would only apply to acoustic guitars, is just sight across the top of the guitar. Just hold it up so that it's at eye level, and so that you have good illumination behind you especially will help, and look across the top of the guitar. And you should see a slight, gentle curvature or radius. The top of guitar should not be flat. Acoustic guitars, even though they're referred to as flat top guitars, the tops are not flat. And I can show you this here even on the main camera, that if we take this acoustic guitar and we put a straight edge that I know is straight across it, you can see that it has a high point in the center. The top is radiused. It actually curves a little bit, and this is exactly what we want. So I can place my straight edge right in the center of the top and have clearance on both ends so that I can see that it has a slight curvature. And that's exactly what we want. that's a sign that the guitar probably has been properly humidified and isn't suffering any issues with climate control or dehumidification. Drying out, guitars getting too dry, is by far the most common issue we see, being here in Canada, where the air we tend to have more of a problem with dry air for more of the year. So backing up to what I was saying, the main thing you want to inspect is to make sure that the guitar top has that curvature to it. It's okay if it actually is sitting a little more closer to a true flat, if it's not a really pronounced hump or anything like that. But what you don't want is you don't want to see a top that's actually concaved, where it's actually sunken down and where I could, in theory, put my straight edge across it like this, and you would actually see a concave where it's highest at the edges and sinks down in the middle. This is a bad sign, and it's a sign that the guitar is probably suffering from low humidity. So sharp fret edges and a sunken top, those are two real telltale signs of a guitar that's probably been dried out a little bit at some point. So that's another key thing you want to check. Okay, so we've checked for structural damage, nothing obvious. We've tuned the guitar up. It seems to be able to tune up to pitch and hold concert pitch without any problems with tension on the guitar. We've checked for the telltale signs of dehumidification, like a sunken top, and we've checked for sharp fret edges. Both of those things seem perfectly fine. So overall, the structural integrity of the guitar looks pretty good in this case. I'm not concerned that the guitar has been severely dried out. I'm not concerned that it's taken a big impact or a big shock. Even if I don't have the trained eye that I do, even if I don't have the experience as a guitar tech, any player can look at this guitar now and trust that most likely it's in pretty good shape and doesn't have any major issues. There can always be things under the hood that you need to know what to look for, but this is pretty good reassurance that we're in good shape. What do we have there? So I got a question there. Could a heel on an acoustic guitar that is lifting be a sign of lack of humidity? Okay, so right here, this is the heel of the guitar. Again, for beginners, just a few of the parts of the guitar. Obviously, we have the body, we have the neck, and this portion here is referred to as the heel of the neck. And this is really the main structural point where it's attached. This is carrying basically all of the load from the guitar strings. So if you do start to see that separation there and you start to see the neck peel away, that can absolutely be a sign of dehumidification. Really, any glue joint failing, I would say, could be caused by dehumidification. And in Canada, it's definitely one of the more common reasons we see for structural repairs, whether it's a bridge coming off, whether it is a heel pulling apart, whether it's a brace coming off, one of the internal pieces on the guitar becoming detached or moving around. Structural glue joint failure is almost always humidity is part of it. And I'm going to explain why. So a standard acoustic guitar, well, okay, so let's do a little carpentry. So let's back up and talk a little bit about wood. If you understand the grain structure of wood, and actually Matt can probably throw up one of my pictures there, picture number 19, which is a close-up under a mic. Wood is a super porous material. It absorbs and releases moisture from the air, as we have talked about. The grain structure is very longitudinal, though. It follows the way the tree was grown. So depending what direction you cut the wood in, how the wood is actually milled, is greatly going to affect the way it behaves under humidity change. So the easiest way to think about that is, for the most part, okay, when a tree grows straight up, right? Now, once you cut that into a piece of wood, if you just cut a piece of wood that's going straight up like a long board, and you could pretty much hold it up next to you and say, this is the exact orientation it was when it was a tree. And then you start doing experiments where you add and remove moisture, you expose it to a high humidity, low humidity environment. What you're going to find is that it's going to expand more side to side than it is up and down. It's built to be strong up and down because it's a tree, right? So it has more longitudinal stiffness than it does lateral stiffness. So especially when it's exposed to dry air or moist air and it's going through change because it's taking on or releasing water into the air, it's going to shrink and swell more in one direction than it is in the other direction. It's going to shrink and swell more laterally than it does longitudinally. So why does this matter? Why am I telling you all this? It's because the guitar is not built with all the pieces of wood with all the grain running exactly the same direction. Indeed, in this example, this guitar is, the top is made out of plywood, so grain direction becomes a little complicated. But on this J45 behind me, which is a solid wood top, all of the grain structure is running longitudinally. You've heard of quarter sawn wood. That's related to this, but ultimately the grain direction is running up and down. When the tree grew, it grew exactly the way that this J45 is sitting. That's the way we cut the board out of it. Now, the bridge, on the other hand, though, the bridge is cut with the grain running across the body of the guitar. So, indeed, when the rosewood tree was growing that the bridge was cut from, the rosewood tree was oriented like this. So, what that means is, if we now that the two pieces are glued together, anywhere one of them goes, the other one's going to go. So any high humidity is going to affect the bridge and the top. Low humidity is going to affect the bridge and the top. But it's going to affect them differently. Ultimately, the bridge is going to shrink and swell laterally on the guitar, whereas the top is going to shrink and swell, or actually, sorry, other way around. The bridge is more likely to shrink and swell this way, whereas the top is more likely to shrink and swell this way. So really, the glue joint that holds the two of them together is being put under maximal stress. It's one of the pieces is stretching and shrinking in one direction, and the other piece of the glue joint is stretching and shrinking in exactly 90 degrees. So it's really a worst case scenario when you have humidity change with two pieces of wood where the grain direction is oriented differently. They're not going to shrink and swell together. Another factor is that they are different species of wood. The guitar tops are almost exclusively made out of softwood. We're starting to see more mahogany top guitars become a lot more popular, like this Martin I have here, but by and large, I'll say 99% of acoustic guitars are using softwood for the top, like spruce or cedar, whereas bridges are almost exclusively made out of either rosewood or ebony, both two of the hardest hardwoods you could possibly build with. So the rate at which a softwood absorbs and releases moisture is very different than the rate at which a hardwood releases and absorbs moisture. So now, back to our J45 example, not only do the grain directions go different directions, so they're expanding in opposite directions, but also the top is going to shrink and swell a lot faster than the bridge is because it's softwood and it's a big piece of softwood with big surface area that it can absorb and shrink and swell a lot, whereas the rosewood is a hardwood. It's going to absorb and release more slowly. So you have different rates of change for the two pieces of wood, different directions of change because of the way that the guitar was constructed, the pieces were oriented. And then finally, one last little detail is that, of course, the top is finished. The guitar top has a lacquer finish on one side of it, and then it's unfinished on the inside, whereas bridges, on acoustic guitars at least, are almost entirely unfinished on steel string guitars. So all these factors, for all these reasons and more, the answer is yes, that a separated glue joint, really any kind of glue joint separation, can absolutely be a result of low humidity, and indeed, that's almost always a factor with glue joint failure. And I know the example that was brought up was the heel separating. The bridge is an easier example to illustrate, but it's the exact same principle. The grain direction of the actual heel itself is different from the heel block, which is what it's glued into. Then you also have, the neck joint's incredibly complicated. You've got the sides coming in as well. They're part of the glue joint. You have the back and the top that are glued onto it. All of this is wrapped together in one giant, incredibly complicated glue joint all around the neck, where you've really got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 main pieces of wood at play, all of which are slightly different, all have different grain directions. They're all shrinking and swelling at different rates. So absolutely, low humidity can lead to joint failure and almost invariably does. High humidity can lead to this as well, too, the wood all swelling up at different rates. Everything I said for the humidity going down, the humidity going up has the same problem. And in fact, high humidity has the added factor of that a really moist, high humidity environment tends to weaken wood glue, period. Most wood glue, when you want to take a glue joint apart, you steam it apart. You introduce moisture and heat, and it reactivates the glue and melts it and makes it easier to take apart. So that's what we do in the repair shop when we want to take a joint apart, but that can happen inadvertently with a guitar that's say sitting in the back seat of your car on a really hot, humid day, baking in the sun for a few hours, and slowly the glue starts to loosen and joints start to pull themselves apart. So high humidity, low humidity both absolutely can be a factor for a separating heel or really any separating glue joint. One other thing to remember too in terms of structural integrity and sort of ongoing storage of your guitar, your guitar is always under a ton of tension. The guitar string, a set of medium gauge steel string guitar strings are like over 140 pounds of tension. Even light gauge electric guitar strings, generally you're looking at around 100 pounds of tension. So there is a lot of force on your guitar at all times. And it has to be that way, and it's good to, and that's good for reasons that we'll explain later. But just remember, your guitar is kind of always a loaded spring. It's always under a lot of force. So it doesn't necessarily take much to cause a problem. That glue joint's a really, really solid glue joint. You're like, oh, geez, I leave it in my car on a sunny day and it comes apart. What a crappy glue joint. Well, don't forget, it's under 140 pounds of tension at all times. So that's a factor that's always there, always pulling on your guitar. Another factor too, when you consider the way headstocks tend to break, as I said, you can sort of picture the leverage there of the impact. If a headstock falls backwards, the leverage of the angled headstock, makes for a very weak break point here. That's also amplified by the string tension. So when you get a little bit of force on the back of your headstock and your headstock breaks, remember you already had 140 pounds of tension from the strings, and now you've just added to that by bumping it in the back of the head. So that's why it's really important to, what I'm really driving at is it's important to handle your guitar with extreme care. The guitar is a rock and roll instrument. You can jump around on stage with them. You can treat them a little rough for sure, but at the end of the day, I say it's always, I think, important to treat any guitar, electric guitar or acoustic guitar, at least as well as you would treat your favorite coffee mug. Don't set it down roughly. Don't bump it into things. I mean, if you knock it a little bit, like your favorite coffee mug, it's probably going to be fine, but it can't handle being set down abruptly every single time. It can't get whacked on a door frame as you walk through or something like that over and over. It may survive a few bumps, but at the end of the day, these are delicate instruments. They're under a lot of stress always, so we want to make sure that we don't introduce any extra stress. That's general handling. And so I guess maybe now is a good time to actually talk about storage, handling the basics of how to kind of store your new guitar, and how to protect it against dry air, and how to prevent damage due to humidity before we jump into setups, which is the next thing we'll check on the guitar. I have a question from Phil. Can the top sinking between the bridge and the sound hole be fixed or flattened out? The action is now too high. So what Phil is experiencing is he probably has a particularly sunken top here in front of his bridge. This does happen. So usually, if you can kind of imagine the tension of string pull, it's about 140 pounds. So you think of it like, the way I always kind of like to visualize that is, if you held the guitar like this, and if you detached the strings here, and instead of winding them up on string heads, if you had a 140-pound adult holding onto the strings, hanging from your guitar, pulling down at all times, that's the amount of force that your guitar is under. It's a lot of force. And over time, what that can do is it can introduce what we call top distortion or top deflection. So I think probably what Phil's experiencing here is that all that force pulling on his bridge over time has slowly just pulled it up, and kind of levered it forwards. And so now, and I'll use the whiteboard here, so now he's left with a situation where if this is his guitar neck, there's the heel, here's his guitar body, there's the back of his guitar, the fingerboard extends out. Now, because of all that force, his guitar bridge is kind of tilted forwards. So there's his guitar bridge, and now his top is coming along. There's his sound hole, would be about here. And then you get this situation where the top kind of waves. And this is exaggerated, obviously. But if that's kind of where our sound hole is there. And the string's coming along, pulling right there on our saddle. And so we wind up with this situation where you have this valley in front and actually a hump behind. Now, this is getting a little bit deeper into things, but this is different than what I talked about, how you want a nice rounded top. You can have too much of a round on your top when it's all localized right behind the bridge. And that's not an example of a nice, well-constructed guitar with a nice, easy radius. It's a guitar where the bridge is actually twisting forward so much that it's distorting the top and making a big hump here and a hollow in front of the bridge. And the result that Phil had is that now his action's too high because ultimately it's pulled the bridge up, and now the bridge is sitting much higher than it should, and so his strings are too high. So he's asking, is there anything that can be done? So there are a few things that can be done. Ultimately, yes, a top can be flattened out. In most cases, nothing's 100%, but we usually can actually flatten out a guitar top. There's a few different approaches. This is getting very deep, so I'll only speak very quickly on it. But basically, you can there's sort of two approaches. One is to actually go inside the guitar and replace some of the internal structure. There's a large plate that sits underneath the bridge that's usually made out of maple or any other very hard wood that just adds stiffness. So we can go in and replace that plate with a thicker, stiffer, more flat piece, and that'll usually force the top back flat. You can also do the same thing with replacing braces or stuff like that. There's a second approach, which is heat pressing the top. It involves introducing heat to try and quite literally bend the wood back into a more flat position. These are both very situational. We'd have to look at the guitar and really see if it's worth it. They're quite involved repairs, and they're always a little bit of an open-ended, well, these are things we can try. They're going to take it in the right direction. As to how long they'll last, how much they're going to remedy the problem is a little bit situational. So there's no easy answer there. But I'd say it's definitely worth bringing the guitar in to a technician to have a look at it. There may be some real there may be a possibility that we can save it. Back in the old days, there used to be a fairly common practice of retopping guitars, actually replacing the entire top. It was more common on classical guitars, but it happened on steel strings too. This was often done to fix problems like this, heavily deflected, warped wooden tops. The guitar just got dried out, exposed to a bad environment. Maybe the wood was never properly dried to begin with. Maybe you stepped on the guitar while you were walking out on stage or something, and the whole top actually needs to be replaced. It's a big involved job. The bridge, the neck have to come off. You're actually building a new top. It's something you would take it to a luthier for, and generally only reserved for the most valuable instruments. It's usually a procedure in the thousands of dollars, and you don't really see it much anymore. But if all else fails, the answer I'm driving at is that ultimately anything can be fixed. All repair questions eventually burn down to a question of is it worth it to you? How much money are you prepared to put into it? Is it worth it compared to replacing the instrument? And of course, once we enter sentimental value into it, so anything can be fixed. It's important to know. Okay, I got a few more questions on the board here. We'll just see related. Oh yeah, okay. Question about lemon oil on the fretboard. We will talk about that. I'll get into that a little bit. I'm going to talk all about cleaning guitars and stuff. So that's in the plan. Martin DRS1, okay, so this is a question where a customer has a Martin DRS1, not too dissimilar from this guitar here. Never noticed any kind of round top as you've described. It's always been a flat top. Is it possible that this is how the guitar made, or do I have a humidity issue? Your Martin should have a round top. Martins have radius tops. Basically every guitar that Long McQuade sells has a round top. Almost every guitar you're going to find in a guitar shop anywhere in the world has a radius top is really what we're talking about here. There is a very small niche market for true flat tops. This is a custom built thing. That's not what you have. So I guess what I would say is this is minor. This is quite minor. It's something that, I don't believe you need a truly trained eye exactly, but it's not a extremely drastic thing that is going to be necessarily instantly obvious. So if you're looking at it and saying, I don't know, it looks flat to me, that may not be a sign you have a problem. I would encourage you to maybe check it with a ruler if you have one. This is a machinist straight edge. It's a very, well, they're not that expensive, but it's too expensive a tool for you to just have around your house unless you're really getting serious about your guitar work or you're doing machining work. This is ideal for checking something like this because I know this is dead straight down to about 1/1000 of an inch, but you do not need something like this. If you have just a normal, nice metal ruler, I mean, pretty much anything that's going to qualify as a straight edge, you can use as a reference. And as long as you're not seeing a true hollow, where it's actually the ruler is resting on the two extreme edges of the body, and you straight up have a dip in the top that you could slide a pick under. That's a problem. That's a sign you may have a humidity issue. The other thing too is as guitars get older, we see top deflection and top distortion happening regardless of how well the guitar was treated, and it's often not an issue. So some minor distortion, if you do have a truly flat guitar, even if that top is a tiny bit sunken, if we're talking about like a 50-year-old guitar, it's probably nothing to worry about. These are things you want to check on a new guitar that's just come from the factory to make sure that it doesn't have an inherent problem. So all that said, guitar quality control is pretty darn good these days, but it's not perfect. We get guitars that were built with improperly dried wood. All right, let's go down a little rabbit hole on wood here. So if you build guitars, if you're going to build an acoustic guitar, you'll probably seek out a few books on the subject. You may go for training at a school. If you really actually read the literature from the beginnings of classical guitar construction especially, and then steel string guitar construction, the first real publications on this are going to advise you to seek out wood that's been ideally cut and dried for minimum 40 years. And if you can find stuff that's been cut and dried for more like 80 to 100 years, that's really what you want. This is coming from the tradition of string family instruments, the violin family instruments, and really coming from more of a handmade, ultra high-end tradition of instrument building, which is really, I mean, instruments were a fairly high-end thing, especially guitars in their very early days. This is simply not possible anymore. I mean, if you go to Martin Guitars in Nazareth, they've got a deep reserve stash, the C.F. Martin family reserve of Brazilian rosewood that's over 100 years old. Some real high-end custom builders are going to be able to build instruments for you with wood that's of that age. If you go for a very high-end bench-made guitar from someone like Linda Manzier or Serge de Jong or Grit Laskin or any of the, pick your favorite great Canadian guitar builder, you're probably going to be getting wood that was dried 50, 60, better part of 100 years. And indeed, that does come up sometimes on high-end models from the larger manufacturers. But generally speaking, by and large, it is just not possible to produce guitars in the quantity that the world wants and wait that long for our wood to cure. Also, too, the research has been done, the materials science has been done, and you can eliminate 99.9% of humidity-related issues if you just dry the wood for a couple of years. So that's more so what's being done. The wood that's going into guitars that is made today, there's just no way we can dry it for 50, 60, 70 years the way that it used to be done on old violins. Wood is a little bit more green. It has been properly dried when the guitar is built, but all this is to say is that every once in a while a guitar does slip through, that everything seemed fine, the wood seemed dimensionally stable, but something about the way it was cut, something about the way it was dry, when it finally did get to the end user, yeah, it was not a properly cured piece of wood when it was glued up, and even though the customer's done everything to maintain the proper humidity environment, the guitar has just gone squirrely. So definitely, if you're noticing any of these telltale humidity signs, the issues that I've identified here, it is worth getting a second opinion, bringing it in to let an expert look at it and see what's going on. It may be nothing, but it's possible that you do have a real issue, even if it's a brand new guitar, even if you're sure that you've maintained perfect humidity the whole time you've owned it, it is possible there's still something going on. So we got a question here from Mathieu about humidity. Is there any impact if it varies from 48 to 55 in your guitar room? Okay, so let's talk about what environment does your guitar want to be in? Ultimately, your guitar wants to be in about 47%, but generally speaking, I'm going to throw this right up here, anywhere between 45% and 55%. I generally consider to be a safe range. You want my real answer? I think you should set your humidifier to 47% humidity. That is the right humidity. But I mean, let's be real here. I mean, unless you're spending $1,000 on a laboratory grade hygrometer, you just ain't measuring humidity that accurately anyways. We're working with a margin of error here on modern home humidifiers anyways. So I personally feel the 45 to 55% range is totally safe. As long as you're within there, I don't think you have anything to be concerned about. If you did even have a little minor humidity issue because you had the guitar at 55, I don't think you're going to get a guitar manufacturer in the world that's going to say you're the cause of the problem, right? Every manufacturer gives you a little bit different range. Some of them do say it's down as low as 43. Personally, I don't think that's getting a little dry, but it's probably not the end of the world. So there is a range there. If you're talking about the difference between 48 to 55, I like 47 personally, but anywhere between 45 and 55 is fine. And there's no need to argue between, 49 versus 52, because you're probably not getting that accurate anyways. The other thing I think to remember too is that in Canada, generally speaking, we have a much bigger issue with drying out our guitars. All of Canada gets really dry in the winter period, and we have long winters. Even places like Vancouver, because it's not just what's going on, which is often thought of as a place that doesn't get a very harsh winter, right? Well, it gets harsh enough that people are turning on their home heating, though. Once you turn on your home heating, that's going to start drying out the air in your home. So regardless of what the humidity may be outside, if you're using home heating, basically everywhere in Canada is going to get issues from dry guitars. So we really, really want to be careful that we don't let the humidity drop too low. Over-humidification is less of a problem, though we do see it, especially in, say, Southern Ontario, where we get very, very humid summers. But it's simply not that common. Just going on the statistics, we, in our shop in Toronto, we see dried out guitars. It is fair to say we see them every single day in the shop. New people coming in with a problem that is related to a dry guitar. People coming in with wet guitars, over-humidified, much less common. It's something maybe we see once every couple of weeks where we have a really severe problem with an over-humidified guitar. And almost invariably, it's people who at one time had a problem drying out their guitar and are now trying to be really, really good about humidifying it and wound up over-humidifying a little bit. The other thing I'll say too is, generally speaking, the effects of dry guitars are things we've talked about: sharp fret ends, glue joints coming apart, the geometry, the structure of the guitar changing. They can be fairly severe consequences, and indeed sometimes life-ending for the guitar if you do get dried out so bad that you do begin to get structural damage and so forth. Over-humidification, putting too much humidity, giving your guitar in too wet of an environment, can have pretty severe consequences too, but they're not quite as severe quite as quickly. If you over-humidify your guitar, the biggest consequences you'll see right away are changes in the playability. You can sometimes see issues with finish. You'll start to see bubbling and popping, especially around hardware. And you can see glue joints release and everything, we talked about it. But generally speaking, we don't see as many problems from over-humidification. Probably the single biggest problem we see from guitars that are over-humidified is that they get mold in the case. So whereas the problems from dry guitars are just, you're far more likely to experience them, especially in Canada, and the effects are more severe more quickly. So that's really the one that we want to address. Very rarely do we have to help people dry out their environment in Canada or dry out their guitar, but we're constantly helping people humidify their environment and humidify their guitar. Okay, so just talking a little bit generally about humidity. I've been all over the place, which is the way this will be. But just to kind of go back real quickly and talk about my wood structure picture that we put up earlier, where we can see the open pores of the piece of spruce. It's a piece of Sitka spruce under a microscope, is what that picture is. You can see how moisture gets in and out of the wood. It just absorbs moisture from the air, and when the air is dry enough, it will release moisture. So if the wood is cured for several years before it's built, what they do is they keep it in an environment that is exactly one stable humidity all the time. Usually most builders build a little below 45, around 42, 43% to get the wood as stable as possible. So the wood has an equilibrium with the air around it. It's in, and this is somewhat oversimplifying here, but if it's in a 45% humidity environment and it sits there for 2 years, you can be pretty much rest assured that the air in the room is 45% and the piece of wood that you're drying is also 45% moisture content. If you then take that piece of wood and you put it in an environment that's 5% humidity, that's really, really dry air, the wood is quickly going to release all of the moisture it has until it's at equilibrium with the room. Same if you take it and put it in a shower in a room where it's really, really, really humid, the wood will continue to actually absorb more and more moisture. So it's releasing moisture into dry air and it's sucking moisture out of moist air, and this of course changes the dimensional properties of the wood, and that's what we're trying to avoid. We want to give our guitar as long as possible where it's in a stable humidity environment so that it stays the same shape, the exact same orientation, all the pieces maintain their structural integrity for as long as possible. When you cut a tree down and you start drying a piece of wood, there's a lot of change that happens in the first couple of years, really in the first couple hours, and especially in the first couple years, where we can achieve this dimensional stability that we talked about, where it's now safe to start gluing pieces together, cutting them, sizing them, dimensioning them, and building wood products out of them that we can ship off that we can rest assured will basically stay the same. That happens after a couple years of drying and curing the wood, and it can be improved by doing things like actually taking the humidity way down and then bringing it back up and then way down again and back up. This is all while it's just a cut board, sort of like pre-shrinking. So there's been some research done there, and we can improve the dimensional stability of a piece of wood in the first few years by doing some of this tempering process of bringing the temperature and humidity up and down. But there's another process that happens, and this takes a lot longer. This happens usually at the quickest. It starts to happen after about 15 years. And this is where the cellular structure of the wood actually starts to change. The held water, the little, I mean, they're not exactly droplets because we're down on a molecular level, but the little bit of water that's inside the wood cell actually starts to become crystalline, and you get to a point where the wood no longer actually has what's called free water, where it can release and absorb moisture from the surrounding environment. It still has moisture content held in that crystal form, but it's no longer free to move in and out of the cells. This doesn't happen 100%. Even the oldest piece of wood in the universe is still going to gain and release a little bit of moisture, but it reduces how much it's affected by humidity. The technical term is hygroscopic. It affects how hygroscopic it is or isn't. So sometimes we get people who have a problem with humidity with their guitar. And they'll say, geez, that's weird. Okay, where are you keeping it? Oh, okay, I'm keeping it in the attic, and it's 10% humidity up there, and it's 15 degrees, and it's terrible. Okay, well, it's a humidity problem. You need to start humidifying the guitar. And the answer we'll kind of get from the player sometimes is like, okay, that's weird because I have my dad's old Yamaha up there, and I've got my Martin that I've had forever, and they're all up there in that room with it, like it's been in the same environment. Why is this guitar affected by the humidity change, but all my other ones are fine? Why do I have to get this guitar set up twice a year, but my other ones I haven't adjusted them in years and they all play great? And the answer is probably, there's a lot of factors that can go into this, but age simply in and of itself is an answer there, that over time the wood actually starts to change on a cellular level, and it does become less hygroscopic. But that process takes a while. And before that starts to happen, the wood is very susceptible to change in the environment. So especially in the first few years of the guitar's life, it's very, very critical that you maintain that stable environment for it so that it has a good start to life, and so that it's in a stable environment where it's not going to be constantly moving around when it's most susceptible to that. There's other things that go into that example that make some guitars a little more temperamental than others, and maybe we can get some more on that later in the Q&A, but that's the basics. Okay, so humidity. We want to keep it between 45 and 55. That's at 21 degrees Celsius, by the way. This is, and I promise we're going to move on to more fun stuff really soon. This is kind of the biggest thing with guitar ownership, whether it's acoustic guitar, electric guitar. All of this applies to electric guitars as well, by the way. Humidity is kind of the big thing that a lot of people don't see coming when they buy a new guitar. You don't realize that you have to worry about the air in the room when you're buying a new guitar. I just want to play my guitar, right? So humidity is already a little bit complicated, and good on you for staying with us so far. 45 to 55% relative humidity is what we want at 21 degrees Celsius, standard room temperature. This is one last little kind of important concept, and if you can follow me through this, then you've pretty much got it for humidity. So we want the guitar at 45 to 55 at 21. That's because what we're really worried about is quite literally how much water is there in the air. And that 45 to 55, that's relative humidity, or RH. That's what we're measuring. What is it relative to? It's relative to the maximum amount of water that the air can hold before the water stops being a gas and turns into a liquid. So if you have a room where the humidity is 50%, then that means that the air is 50% full of water. It doesn't mean that the air is 50% water. It means that it's holding 50% of the maximum it can hold. If you get up to 99%, you have an extremely, extremely humid room where it is almost full. This is the most H2O that the air can hold as a gas. And when you tip over to 100% humidity, the air can no longer hold any more H2O as a gas, and it turns it into actual liquid water. And this is when you get condensation. It rains. Quite literally, this is what happens when it rains. When your humidity goes up above 100%, the air can't hold the water anymore, and it starts dripping. So we don't never want to get anywhere near that with a guitar, obviously. We want 45 to 50%, 55%. So we want our air to be about half full of water, about half as much as it can hold, at 21 degrees. Air is affected by temperature, of course. The temperature of the air affects how much water it can hold. Cold air cannot hold nearly as much water as warm air. If you have very, very warm air that is at 50%, it will have more water in it than very, very cold air that is at 50%. So, and this is why generally dry air and cold air tend to sort of go hand in hand. So 21 degrees is room temperature. That's about average. So let's say we have 50% humidity at 21 degrees. Everything's great. It's in equilibrium with our guitar. Now let's say that temperature goes right up. It's a hot day and I don't have air conditioning, and now it's 30 degrees in my house. But I check my humidifier and it's still okay. I'm still at 50%. Okay, good. The problem is, because the air is so much hotter, it can actually hold a lot more water. So if it's at 50% at 30 degrees, that's far, far, far higher moisture content than 50% at 21 degrees. So actually, and you can do there's a million calculators online, you can do the math. I didn't have the formula ready here, but you can determine if my air is actually a little hotter, what do I want to adjust my humidity to? So I'll tell you the way that this comes up is generally with cold air. And I will explain this concept by telling a story. I had a customer about 5 years ago come into the Toronto store with a guitar very similar to this one here, Mahogany Martin. And this customer was a great customer. We'd been seeing him for years. He bought many guitars, a studio player, had a great home studio, took really good care of his stuff generally. And he brings his guitar that he's had about 1 year into me, and the back is completely cracked open. This seam is open so wide you could put your hand into it. The back literally peeled open like a flower. The fret edges were very sharp. The top, you could see, was absolutely sunken. There was a huge, extremely, instantly obvious dip in the top, and the back had dried out so much that it cracked. This was one of the most dried out guitars I had ever seen. The customer sends me some pictures of his home studio with his humidifier, with his temperature, with his humidity gauge right above it. He's got the humidity gauge on the humidifier. He's got an extra humidity gauge on the wall. It's a tiny little room. He's got his other guitars. He's got his humidifier set up. He's saying, I don't know how the heck this happened. He even showed me the min-max on his humidity gauge, and it showed that in the last 6 months, it had never dropped below 45%. How the heck did I dry my guitar out if my humidity never dropped below 45%? Well, I got him to check the min-max on his moisture gauge, which is also a temperature gauge, and we discovered something interesting. Although his humidity never dropped below 45%, his temperature did go way down. He had about a week where his temperature in his studio was like 10 degrees. It was in his basement. He just hadn't been using it a lot. Now, he was keeping a good eye on the humidity because he knew it was important, but he had forgotten about temperature. So sure, he had 2 weeks where his temperature was down at like 10 degrees. So sure, he was at 50%, but the air was half the temperature it was supposed to be. So the air was still 50% full of water. It still had a 50% moisture content, but because the air was so cold, it couldn't hold nearly as much water in the first place. The 100% fill line was very different. So 50% humidity at 10 degrees is a lot less moisture than 50% humidity at 21 degrees. And as you go up in temperature and the relative stays the same, the actual moisture content's a lot higher. So my point is that the customer, although he managed to maintain 50% humidity, what he forgot about was the temperature and the relative aspect of humidity. So although his relative humidity for how cold his air was, he was still at 50% maximum for that cold air. The air is so cold that it didn't matter if he was at 100% humidity. The air is too cold to ever hold enough moisture to keep his guitar from drying out. So unfortunately, that cold, dry air, even though it was 50% humidity at only 10 degrees, that cold, dry air just sucked all the moisture out of his guitar. And just real quick to explain why and how that happened and how that's a result of humidity, the crack down the back is an absolute telltale humidity sign. In fact, I think I've got another picture there that Matt can probably put up. Yeah, number 18, which is a picture of a dryness crack on a Gibson Super Jumbo. These kind of cracks are telltale signs of severely dried out guitar. This is kind of about the end of the road with humidity when you've really, really let it get bad. What's happening, again, I talked about how the wood shrinks. It shrinks more laterally across the grain. So the tree grew like this, the grain was up and down, and when the wood shrinks, it's just pulling itself in from the outside. The whole thing's shrinking in. So what you have to remember, though, is that the only place this guitar is glued is around the edge. So it has an absolute stop all around the edge. That's where it's glued, but the wood is trying to shrink. So the first thing that happens is this nice, whether it's the top or the back, the nice rounded radius starts to flatten out because the top's getting shorter and shorter as it shrinks. And eventually, if it just can't shrink anymore and it's fixed, glued around the edges, it cracks, it lets go. And that's exactly what we're looking at in that picture, is a guitar where the top just couldn't shrink anymore, something had to give. And it's either going to come apart at one of the edges, which is less common, or it's just going to break right in the middle. Generally speaking, with all woodworking, any area where you've glued two pieces of wood together is going to be the strongest point. It's going to be stronger than the surrounding wood. So the edge is very, very stiff and strong, so when the wood is shrinking and it can't shrink anymore, rather than come apart nice and clean on a seam, it's just going to split in two wherever its weakest point is, and that's what we're looking at. So that's some extreme dryness damage there. Okay, let's talk about how to humidify your guitar real quick, because I know there's lots of questions about this. This is like the number one thing too. We'll talk about humidifiers real quick, and then we'll move on to setup. But if you're fairly new as a player, maybe you just kind of got your first really good guitar, your first kind of step up guitar, and you really want to do everything right to take care of it. Guitars are pretty tough, really. I mean, you know, there's not much that you can buy for, you know, under a couple $1,000 now that you can pass on to your grandkids, but guitars kind of are one of those things. It's pretty amazing how resilient and how tough and how long-lasting they are. But you gotta mind the humidity thing. If you take care of humidity, almost everything else about the guitar, it's hard to really do a lot of damage. You know, if you don't get it set up quite as often as you should, if you don't oil the fingerboard quite as often as you should, things like that, it's unlikely you're going to do any real long-term damage. But the humidity thing is the one place. I mean, it's like getting the oil changed in your car. Is the sort of textbook example. It's not that complicated, but it's relentless. If you don't pay attention to it, the consequences could be big. But if you do that, there's not a whole lot else you have to worry about. Okay, so let's talk about humidity. So first of all, with maintaining humidity, the easiest thing is just to do what we do in our stores, which is humidify the room. Keep the room at 21 degrees. It's between 45 and 55, and you're golden. It's the same environment that the wood was cured to for those years at the manufacturer. That's the same humidity that the guitar factory was at. That's hopefully the same humidity that the warehouse was kept at. Your guitar is going to experience the same humidity all the time. You can take it down off the stand, off the wall, play it as much as you want, and the humidity is always the same. So that's all obviously easy, is to just keep your house at appropriate humidity. easy in concept, almost impossible in practice. Very, very few people can put up with that level of humidity in their home. I know it is supposedly a good humidity for human health and so forth, and a lot of people say, oh, I keep my house that humid regularly anyways, but in my experience, that's pretty rare. We more often will get people commenting on how humid our store is when you walk in. It's pretty swampy for a lot of people, especially if you have allergies and stuff like that. So keeping the room humidified, it's doable if you have a studio. What I recommend is a very small room. You can get a small auxiliary humidifier just from any department store or hardware store, anything like that. As long as you keep the humidity up, keep the temperature in the right range, your guitar is always going to be happy. When you think about it, it's like the tree was cut down and then it went through its entire life from being boards on a shelf to getting constructed to coming up here on hopefully a heated shipping truck and then into a humidified warehouse, into a humidified music store, and then delivered to you. It's almost like refrigerated groceries or something. We have to be taking steps all along the way to keep it in good shape, and you just keep that going by turning your own home into an environment that's appropriate. Most people don't do this though. Most people instead use a guitar case to create a humidified environment within their home. This is definitely going to be simpler if you have anything short of a flawlessly humidified modern home with excellent HVAC. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep this guitar in a nice hard shell guitar case. Nice snug fit. What we're going to do is turn this guitar case into a humidified environment, into like a little humidor basically, using a case humidifier. Oops. There are many types of case humidifiers, and I will show you most of them now. Oh yeah, one thing I want to say actually before we talk about humidifiers, I did say we do sometimes get people over humidifying guitars. It doesn't happen much, but it does happen. And usually it's people who over humidify their guitar with an artificial humidity source like this because they're worried about drying it out and they ended up going too far in the other direction. It doesn't happen much, but it does happen. Another thing sometimes is, people are trusting the little reading on their thermostat in their home. Those things are often not that accurate. Spend the $25 and get a digital moisture meter, a hygrometer, not a hydrometer, but a hygrometer. They're usually sold as a combination humidity and temperature gauge, and you can just keep it inside your guitar case at all times, and it will tell you what the temperature and what the humidity is. You can track min-max, you can see if it went up or down, and you'll always know exactly what it is. Close the guitar up inside the case. It's now in a basically sealed environment, and that moisture gauge is going to tell you if your guitar is dry or if your guitar is wet. This all works, by the way, in a soft gig bag. The backpack style bags are a lot more popular. This whole principle does work, but not as well for obvious reasons. The zipper is an obvious seal point. Zippers aren't sealed, and just the cloth nature of the bag, they're just not as good humidity seals. But hard shell cases generally made out of plywood. They're sealed with Tolex, which is basically a moisture barrier. And they have this long Tolex seal going all the way around the top of the guitar case that mates with the rim of the body of the guitar case as well. So when you close this thing up with all the buckles, it's a pretty darn sealed environment. It works way better in a hard case. Upgrading to a hard case over a soft case is the best money you can spend for protecting your guitar, not just for the obvious structural protection from impact or falling, but for the humidity protection. Even just keeping your guitar in a hard case as opposed to a soft case, if you do nothing else, is going to already get you half of the way towards taking better care and not having a humidity problem. So keeping a moisture gauge inside the case, there's lots of different options. There's some that are more fancy than others. There's even ones you can get now that connect with Bluetooth to your phone. You can check it remotely without opening the case. You can check the humidity. You can set it up to give you alerts if the humidity drops or goes too high or too low. There's all sorts of great products out there for monitoring the humidity, but that's the most important thing, is that first and foremost you monitor the humidity so you know what you're dealing with. Even at our store in Toronto, I mean, we have a extremely sophisticated humidification system for our entire store with millions of dollars in inventory that we can't afford to have dry out. It's very important to us to have it perfect. We have to maintain that thing on a regular basis. If we didn't have moisture gauges plastered all over our store, we would never know when we had a problem or not. So You don't know what you're dealing with unless you actually measure it, so use a moisture gauge. You can buy these from us. You can get them almost anywhere, though. Drugstores sell them. Very easy product to find. By the way, too, I'll just put it out there quickly, like this is a technician's secret. You can measure the humidity in a guitar, regardless of what the room is. We don't have to have a discussion about, well, where are you keeping it? What's the humidity of where you're keeping it? What's the temperature? How long does it spend there? How long do you take it in and out of the case? We can actually measure the humidity in your guitar, the specific humidity of the wood in your guitar, by sealing it up in a case for a few hours, ideally overnight, with a moisture gauge. Even if the humidity in my room is really great, like we're 50% at 21 degrees here, but I have a suspicion this guitar is dried out, I'll just seal it up with a hygrometer with a moisture gauge, leave it for really just a couple of minutes, but ideally if I can give it an hour or two, the best is if you can leave it overnight and then check. That humidity gauge is going to get dragged down to whatever the humidity of the wood is. If I seal the guitar case in, it takes one big gulp of air, if you think of it that way. It takes a big gulp of properly humidified 50% humidity air. But if the guitar is dried out, it's going to very quickly start sucking that moisture out of the air that's sealed inside the guitar case and drag it down lower. So if my guitar is dried out to, say, 35% humidity, it's a dry guitar, and the room that I'm in is perfect, it's 50%, 21 degrees, great. I can just seal it in, and then when I check it in a few minutes, I'm going to open it up, and that moisture gauge is going to read something closer to 35, because just in that short time, the nice, well-humidified air that I sealed in here with the guitar has been completely stripped of all moisture because it got sucked into the dry guitar. So we can actually measure your guitar. All the telltale signs, checking for the way guitars might tell you if they are or aren't dried out, none of that's necessary anymore because now you can buy a digital moisture gauge for under $25. So we can actually measure and know for sure whether a guitar is dried out or not. Gone are the days of players fighting with their guitar technician over whether or not a guitar is dried out. We can measure it and get an objective answer. So first and foremost, measure your humidity. If it's anything below 45, you should probably be humidifying. There's really, as the way I see it, there's really two systems that you can use for humidifying a guitar in your case. Let's say your guitar is a little dried out, winter's coming up, the home heating's coming on, it's time to start humidifying your guitar. There's really two ways you can do this. The first one, most simple system, is just basically a sponge. These systems are very popular. Planet Waves makes them. Sometimes you get them for free with guitars. This is literally just a little plastic case that goes down between your strings, hangs down on the inside of the guitar, because the inside's all unfinished. That's the most susceptible point to moisture gain and loss. And this is literally just a little plastic shell that has, inside of it, a sponge. You soak the sponge in water, you put it in the plastic case, and you put the plastic case inside your guitar, and you close the lid. Pretty simple. So you can take that, it's got holes in it, soak it in a glass of water for 30 seconds, let it absorb as much moisture as possible, shake it out, just get any extra drops off it, maybe wipe it down with a cloth. It's designed in a way so that it can't drip water out the bottom. As long as the outside is clean of any droplets, you're going to be fine. Put it down inside the guitar, close the case. Now, what we basically have is a decoy moisture source inside the guitar. So if I have a very dry room, my house is dry, I can't, and it is, and I can't, there's nothing I can do about it. So if I want my guitars to keep from getting dried out, every time I seal them away in their little humidor for the night, I have to put in this sponge with a decoy moisture source. So when I close the case and it takes a big gulp of the dry air in my house, that sponge is there as a extra added moisture source. So the air that's seeking equilibrium, it can take moisture out of that sponge instead of taking it out of my guitar. And likewise, if the guitar is so dry that it's sucking moisture out of the air, the sponge will be there to put more moisture into the air so that the guitar doesn't have to suck as much out. All three pieces are going to be trying to reach equilibrium. Ultimately, that's all that's happening with humidity issues, is the wood trying to reach equilibrium with the air around it. So if you introduce an added moisture source like this, the air inside the case is going to be a little bit more humid, and thus when equilibrium is reached, everything will be a little bit more humid. The sponge is humid, the air will be a bit more humid, and the wood in the guitar will be a bit more humid. Recommend a humidifier with electric cases? Absolutely, 100%. The real, this is something, you know, we definitely drum on it a lot more with acoustic guitars, but speaking as a technician, electric guitars are just as susceptible. You're not going to get the problems with the sound box, obviously. There isn't as much carpentry, there's not as much glue joints to deal with, but electric guitars still have a wooden fingerboard, they still have a wooden neck. They have a lot more hardware screwed into them, which can start to do strange things under humidity changes. So yes, electric guitars should have a humidifier in the case with them. You're not going to get a system that goes down in the sound hole like this. It's going to be something that just sits in the case and creates a humid environment inside of the case. There's absolutely no harm to it, and you will avoid having problems. Generally speaking, I mean, you're not going to get the structural issues that you do with an acoustic guitar, but you can still get problems with your neck, right? That's the biggest thing we see with acoustic guitars when they get dried out, is you get necks warping, you get a no longer effective truss rod, all sorts of stuff we'll get into when we talk about setups, but 100%. The effects on an acoustic are much more obvious and devastating, but electrics need to be humidified as well. Question about using distilled water instead of tap water in a humidifier. So all humidifiers that you put water into, whether it's the sponge that we just looked at, whether it's one of these little puck systems, which is kind of the same concept, it's just a little more rudimentary. It's just a little plastic case with a hole in it so that air can get in and out, and a little clay sponge that you add water to. And same thing, it just provides an extra moisture source inside the guitar. And then these are just case humidifiers, they just sit in the case. And then the last one, and I'll talk about distilled water, the last one here is the Oasis humidifier. These are very popular. This is what we tend to recommend. They're by far the best in this style of humidifier. This is a similar concept. You just fill it up with water. It's kind of like a little bottle, and this is all a mesh membrane here that allows a little bit of moisture to slowly be released. So you fill it up with water, and it sits down in same thing inside the sound hole. All of these recommend you use distilled water. That's standard advice. You should use distilled water. That is what they recommend. I think it's a lot less critical with these two because they're really just a sponge that's giving off water through these giant holes. The Oasis system, the way it uses this rate controlling membrane, that it allows the moisture to be gained and lost in a consistent, even way so that it doesn't shock the guitar with a big, huge dump of water immediately. So anyways, this membrane can start to become calcified over time. It depends a little bit on your tap water. You are supposed to use distilled water on all of these. In theory, all of these will last forever if you use distilled water. They're very simple technology. If you have easy access to distilled water and you don't mind, absolutely 100% do that. That is what the manufacturer recommends. That said, all of them will work if you just put tap water in them. They will still work. You're probably going to have to buy a new one of these every year because it'll get calcified and it will no longer function. But 100%, if you get a new guitar home and you need to humidify it and you don't have distilled water, use tap water. Do not wait until tomorrow when you can go get distilled water. The worst case scenario is you'll damage a $20 humidifier, and that's a lot better than damaging a guitar of any value. A lot of people find the distilled water thing just annoying, and they just say, screw it, I'll just buy a new one of these every year and let it calcify. Another question, are guitars with laminate back and sides more resistant to humidity issues? The short answer is yes. So laminate, by the way, laminate's a term that's used a lot in guitar construction, but effectively what we're talking about is plywood. Rather than being made out of a solid piece of wood like this, it's a plywood, usually 3, sometimes we see 5 plies of crisscrossing grain with a layer of glue in between them. This makes for a much more dimensionally stable product. It's a manufactured wood product. It's getting closer almost to being a synthetic. So they are more dimensionally stable. They won't gain and lose water as quickly. And they won't move as much. They won't deflect as much as they do gain and lose water. So the laminate pieces of the guitar are more resistant to humidity issues, yes. However, They are not resistant enough to really change anything about the way you should behave. You should still humidify a laminate instrument. If you know that you're terrible about taking care of your stuff, if you're giving a guitar as a gift to someone you know won't take care of it, if you're looking for a guitar to take on a cruise through the Arctic or something, yeah, go with a laminate. It's probably going to be a little more stable. But at the end of the day, laminate guitars are not a way out of this. It's not, oh, you know, you don't want to deal with humidity, so just buy a laminate guitar. They're tougher. They are a little tougher, but you're probably still going to get issues if you don't humidify it. I would remind everyone as well, too, with a laminate guitar, the top, back, and sides may be laminate, but that's basically where the differences end. Even laminate guitars still almost invariably have solid wood for the neck, solid wood for the fingerboard, the bridge is solid wood, and all of the internal bracing, the bridge plate, all of that is made of solid wood. So there's no, even laminate guitars are not free of solid wood. They still have a lot of solid wood on them. And back to what we talked about with our J45, how the pieces of wood are shrinking and expanding in different directions. That can even be exacerbated a bit on laminate instruments because the laminate hardly moves at all. Meanwhile, all the braces and all the actual solid wood pieces that are glued to it, they do move. So the working itself loose can even be a little more extreme on laminate instruments. And that's a good question, and I want to address very quickly the Martin X series guitars, which I didn't bring one of, but any Martin that has the letter X in it has some synthetic material on it. The top, back, and sides are made for. Martin uses an engineered wood product that they just call HPL, high pressure laminate. It's not even exactly a plywood. What it is it's sheets of paper. I believe it's hundreds of sheets of paper with glue in between each layer that are put under an ultra high pressure. And they make a synthetic wood-like product that they can then build guitars out of. This is what they're building in their Mexican factory. It's part of their sustainability issue. It's a way to use waste product from the wood milling industry and basically not have to use a fresh, beautiful piece of rosewood every time you want to build a more affordable guitar or a guitar that's just meant for road work or something like that. So these come in a whole bunch of different finishes, and usually what they are, they're made to look like real wood, but we do see some that are kind of funkier. They make ones that are all black. They've done one that have graphics and things like that on them and so forth. And you may see these as an option where it's not wood, it's HPL, it's a synthetic, it's made from something different. However, we still see humidity issues on these because as much as it is a synthetic product, it's still made from wood. It's a paper product, it's a wood product, so it does gain and lose moisture, and it does behave somewhat the same way as solid wood does. So if you have one of those black Martin guitars, if you have a Martin X series, if there's X in the name, it may have a solid wood top, but it has synthetic back and sides. And you can see when you look inside, they're very clearly not wood. They look different, right? And so sometimes we have gotten issues where I'm, and unfortunately we've even sometimes had salespeople give the advice of like, yeah, you don't need to humidify it as much. Speaking as a guitar technician, again, it's like the plywood thing, laminate guitar thing. They're a little more resilient, but it really doesn't change anything for the way you need to treat your guitar. Short of a carbon fiber guitar, all guitars require humidity. The only real exception is guitars from the likes of McPherson or Rain Song or Composite or any of the companies making actual true carbon fiber guitars where every last inch of the guitar is made out of carbon fiber. Those guitars are dimensionally stable. They don't require humidity. You could play them in the shower. You could play them at the North Pole and they wouldn't be affected. Those are really the only category of guitar that you don't need to worry about humidity. So I want to talk about the other type of humidifier real quick before we get on to setups. So these three that we looked at basically are all versions of the same idea. It's a little sponge, you add water to it, and now it means there's more humidity inside your case than there would have been otherwise. All of these are the same thing. You're just introducing another moisture source so that to help you with your dry air. When you lock the dry air in the case with your guitar, you're sending on a little decoy, a little extra something to try and get the air a little bit more moist inside your guitar. All of these, by the way, too, you do run the risk of over-humidifying the guitar potentially, as they're just going to keep dumping the water into that environment. So you do need to keep an eye on your moisture gauge, and you do need to make sure as you're using these that you don't start to tread up into the 60% humidity range and spend lots of time above that. Again, you will sometimes also start to notice issues like mold, for example, around the case if you do use these without also measuring the humidity. This is the only way you're really going to over-humidify your guitar. I want to talk very quickly about this system. This is really the best thing to happen to instrument humidity in the last who knows how long. This is the D'Addario two-way humidity system. It used to be called Humidipack. In fact, I see this one I have here is still labeled Humidipack, so I think they call it the two-way humidity system now. This is just great. So this is actually a replaceable system. You have to buy new packets every once in a while. But what this actually does, this is like a bag of water, basically. And it has some chemicals in it. I don't claim to know exactly what is going on in there, but it's a bag of liquid of some kind. I guess it's actually a plasma now that I think about it, but regardless. And the paper bag will release or gain moisture to the air around it. So the same as our ones that we put humidity, that we put water into and let them release, this comes pre-filled with water, and it releases it into the environment of our case. Now, the great feature about this is that it is engineered to only release moisture up to a point, up to 50% relative humidity at 21 degrees. It may be slightly higher than that, but the point is, this will stop releasing moisture once you've gone up to the right humidity level. So you can't over-humidify a guitar with one of these. We could take 20 of these and put them in here and seal it up, and when I take it out, the humidity would still be at 50% because they won't dump any more than they're supposed to. The other great thing about these is that they will absorb moisture from the air if it is above 50%. So it's a two-way system. Put this thing in your guitar case, and if the humidity is too high, it will suck moisture out of the air and bring it down to where it should be. If the humidity is too low, it will give off moisture and bring it up to where it should be. It comes with 3 pouches. You put one in the case, usually up by the headstock. If it's an acoustic, the other ones, they give you this little bag so that they can hang down inside. Let those live inside your guitar case. Make sure they never dry out and fully harden up. It's still a good idea to keep an eye on what the humidity's at with the digital gauge. Make sure there's no funny business, but you basically don't have to think about them. They just live in there. The only thing you really have to watch out for is that they don't fully dry out where they will go rock hard. They won't feel like a bag of water anymore. They're rock hard. You can bang them on the table. That's when they've given off all the moisture they have and they have no more to give. At which point you have to buy new pouches. You buy them as a refill. They're not too expensive. Most people in Canada find if you exclusively use this system and you have a really dry home, you're not going to need to buy more than 2 or 3 of them, right? Okay, so I'm going to move on from humidity. This is something I've spent my entire life talking about, obviously, and I know a lot of people have already heard it, so let's keep going. I strongly recommend the two-way humidity system just because it's foolproof and you don't have to really do anything. The human factor that comes in with all of these sponge-based humidifiers, these are the less expensive and seemingly simpler options, but what it comes down to is that these two, you basically have to fill them with water every single day. This one's a little better, usually a week to 2 weeks, depending how dry your home is, but it's a constant maintenance thing. Even if you're not playing guitar, even if you're not going down, you still have to keep an eye on these things. The D'Addario two-way system takes all the guesswork out of it. You know it's down there. Check your guitar. If you're not playing your guitar, just check it once every couple weeks. Make sure they haven't got hard. It's super easy. Okay, let's talk about setups. This is really the main thing that we wanted to talk about, but humidity is just so darn important. Okay, what is a guitar setup? Great question. I guess the first concept we really need to establish is that guitars are adjustable. They don't come one way from the factory. They're adjustable. They need to be adjusted in order to perform properly. For the most part, most guitars arrive in a condition that is playable, but is not going to be optimal depending what your demands are. And indeed, some guitars do come out of the box being basically unplayable right from the start. Okay, so I'm going to go over to my drawing board here, and we're going to discuss a few real basic concepts. The sacred geometry of guitar setup. So there's really three, I see we got a little bit of bleed through here. Okay. Key concepts that we're going to talk about are truss rod, neck angle, saddle, and nut height. These are arguably kind of two separate things, but they sort of go hand in hand. The angle of the neck, the adjustment of the truss rod, and the height at the saddle and the nut is going to determine the setup on every single guitar. These are basically the only adjustments we really need to concern ourselves with if we're going to simplify it. Okay, if we can take a quick look at image number 1, truss rod, bow, and relief. So this image shows truss rod adjusted a few different ways: straight, properly relieved, and backbowed. And what we really need to understand, I think, before we start getting into it too much, is understanding how strings move, and the concept that, of course, as strings vibrate, they have a very wide excursion. They move around as they vibrate, and they require room to move. And they require more room in the middle of their travel, in the exact center, right where the 12th fret would be if you plucked an open string. They require more excursion there than they do at the ends. I mean, at the absolute terminus of a stretched string, when you pluck it, it doesn't move at all, of course, because it's held down at a fulcrum, and in the middle it moves a maximal amount. So the amount of room that your string needs to vibrate is different at different points along the neck. So an absolutely straight neck would introduce a lot of compromises. If we have an absolutely straight neck, as we can see in the diagram there, and it's just a perfectly straight line or something resembling it, we have our nut at one end and our saddle at the other end. When the string is plucked, it's of course going to vibrate with maximal excursion right in the center. So what we're going to have is it's going to be too close to the fingerboard right in the middle and much further away than it needs to be at the ends. One thing that basically every single customer who comes in for a setup asks for, the thing that everybody wants, is low action with no buzzing. So action, by the way, describes how high your strings are off the fingerboard. So a guitar where the strings sit very, very low on the fingerboard and they're very, very close to the frets and they're very easy to press down, that's a guitar with low action. A guitar where the strings are sitting extremely high and they take Herculean strength to press down, that's a guitar with high action. Almost everybody wants low action because it's easier on your fingertips. It's easier to press down, it's more comfortable, especially doing bar chords. You don't get as much pain. Everybody wants low action. They want it as low as they can possibly get it. But the problem you bump into when you lower the action too much is that when you pluck the string and it starts vibrating, it will actually start hitting your frets because it's so low, and then you get string buzz, of course, which doesn't sound exactly like this, but basically sounds like where your strings don't sound properly because rather than ringing clearly, they're bouncing off one of the frets. So how do you get low action without buzzing? Well, the key is that, first of all, we can take advantage of the fact that the string does not require as much room to travel at the beginning and end towards its terminus. It only needs a lot of space really in the middle. So if we adjust our neck so that the fingerboard better matches the travel of the string, then we can get the string closer to the frets all the way along the fretboard without having to actually, and still have it ring clearly and sound good. So that's where the truss rod comes in. Truss rod controls neck relief. Let's look at a truss rod really quickly. So there are a few different kinds of truss rods. They work differently. Let's go to the overhead camera for this maybe real quick. So I have here a truss rod. Exciting. I'm just getting used to the camera up there. Okay. And for reference, let's just throw a straight edge on it here. Okay, so this is what's inside your guitar neck in most cases. If you have a guitar like this Martin right here, this is what would actually be inside the guitar, sitting inside the neck just below the fingerboard. It's actually installed in there, and this nut at the end pokes out inside the sound hole, and you can reach inside with a wrench and adjust it. So this thing is already a little bit cranked tight, so we'll just straighten it out. Okay, so there it is against this straight edge, and you can see that it's pretty much straight, maybe a little bit bowed there, and that may be a little bit tough to see, but this will be extremely obvious. Now if I tighten this rod, if I crank it down tight, we will see a very noticeable change here as soon as I can get the wrench in. Okay. If I tighten this rod, you can see what happens. So there's two pieces of metal here. This one long, stiff beam here, which is just welded at either end, and then it's threaded. And then this long steel rod here is actually what spins when we turn the nut. It's threaded at both ends, so as we tighten it down, it's actually pulling this welded rod closer together. But of course, it's just a steel rod, and it's made out of tempered steel. It's perfectly square, so it can't compress as we're trying to pull it together. So instead, it flexes, right? And we can continue to even, like, we can try pushing it even a little bit further and see how far it will go. So you can see what's happening there. So if that's sitting inside our guitar, now if we go back the other direction, right? I'll just take it back quickly. So if I unwind it, first of all, it straightens out. We go back to that dead straight neck, which is not what we want. And we keep cranking the other way. We can see it actually forces it into what we would call relief, where it's bent. So this really is what we're affecting here is the actual fingerboard itself. So that's what's inside your guitar. And I'll just show you what it looks like on a neck really quickly. There we go. So here's a Martin neck. Neck bolt, that's the actual adjustment nut right there. So that's what is down inside the sound hole. So we can look at this neck and see, and this is a little tough to see, but this neck is basically straight. As I crank this rod really tight, and hopefully this will be visible, I can certainly show you now that. So now, it may not be super easy to see, but we now have the neck back bowed. It's back bowed away, and this straight edge will actually rock back and forth on it now because it's back bowed. And I can spin it the other way and get the opposite effect. But you got an idea of what we're talking about here. So the truss rod can control curving the neck forward into what we call relief, or bowing it backwards in what we call back bow. All of this is in the interest of fighting the string pull, the natural tension that the strings are exerting, pulling the neck into relief. So if we take, let's maybe grab an electric guitar here. Okay, so remembering that we've got 100 so pounds of tension of the strings pulling the neck forward, pulling it into relief. The truss rod's what we can use to actually fight back against that string tension and bring the neck back into being straight or even into backbone. We can control how much relief is in there. What you want for relief on a neck is you want to have just enough room so that the string can vibrate freely, but not so much relief that you get really high string action. The other thing too, so just in terms of talking about different necks, a really straight neck doesn't work, right? This is straight. Ooh. And now let's talk about back bow. So if you have back bow on your neck, this is where your fingerboard actually curves back. And that's obviously going to be a problem for string exertion, because even having a straight string is now coming way too close to the fingerboard in the center. And of course, once it starts vibrating, now you're going to have a real problem. So back bow never works and is never a good thing. What you want is relief. Get some relief. Proper relief means that your string, when it is plucked, will now vibrate and basically match the shape of the fingerboard perfectly. So we want to have a little bit of relief in the neck so that the string can vibrate freely, but we don't want to have so much relief that the strings are sitting really high on the fingerboard and that they're creating a low spot in the middle. Some people run their neck dead straight with no relief. No back bow either. Dead straight, like what we're talking about here. Very few people, but some people do. A lot of people talk about liking a straight neck. Usually when you talk about liking a straight neck, what you mean is that you like it close to straight with just a tiny little bit of relief. Some people more, some people less. Some people do actually like it dead straight, and this is possible. It is something you can make work. But 99% of customers want some amount of relief in your neck. That's what every manufacturer recommends. There isn't a manufacturer on earth that recommends you run a neck straight. It's always some amount of relief. So that's the first thing we really want to be able to assess, is whether or not our guitar has relief. So there's different ways you can do this. The first and simplest way that a guitar tech does is simply by looking at the neck and sighting it. And I can see from looking at this that it has a bit of relief in it. It could probably be a little bit straighter, we'd have to see. But you know, it's not backbowed, it's not dead straight, it does have some relief. That's really easy for me to tell because I've probably looked at 30,000 necks in my life. That's not something that is going to be super helpful as a brand new player or as a new guitar tech. I encourage you to always sight your neck. Look down it, does it look straight? Look at as many necks as you possibly can, because you really just got to look at a million of them before you get the hang of this, right? I'm going to show you the other ways to assess the relief, but it's always good. Look at every neck, look at as many guitars as you can, and before long, you'll start to be able to notice things and see things just from looking at them. But at first, if you haven't looked at hundreds of necks, you want something that's a little more foolproof. You want a reference, an easier way to check this. So there's two ways you can do it. The real machinist's way, if you're a real nerd, is to basically recreate exactly what we've done in diagram here. You can take, again, a machinist's straight edge, you can place it on the neck, and this will give you a reading of whether or not you have relief. If the guitar is back-bowed, of course, the straight edge will rock because the neck is bowed backwards. If it's totally flat, the straight edge will sit perfectly on your flat fingerboard. And if it has relief, which it should, it will sit solidly on the fingerboard, but you'll be able to look and see a little bit of a gap in between. And here, we can use camera 3 here to represent some of this. So if you have relief, you'll be able to place a straight edge on it and see some gap underneath. And you can even come in and check with, this is a machinist feeler gauge, but you can come in and check with anything, with a slip of paper, with a little piece of business card or something, to see that yes, indeed, I do have a little bit of a gap here between the straight edge and the frets, and that the contact points, the only contact points the straight edge is making, should be the first and the last fret, so that you have even relief all the way across. Most people don't own a machinist straight edge, and why would you? So the good news is we have basically a perfect, flawless straight edge available to us right here on the guitar, which is a guitar string. So we can actually press down the string at the first fret and press it down at the last fret, and now the string is acting as a perfect straight edge, right? Because it's a taut chord pulled straight. As long as the string isn't damaged or otherwise affected, it's going to form a perfectly, absolutely flawless straight edge that we can use for this purpose. So you can push down the string at the first fret and at the last fret, and you can see how much of a gap there is between the bottom of the string and the frets in the middle of the fingerboard, and that will tell you if you have some relief. Might be a little bit easier to see on the bass strings here, no, I think it's easier to see on the treble strings. So we can see, if I press it down at the first fret and at the last fret, I can get a little bit of movement out of the string there. And now, to show you how that would be different, if I'm just going to come in here and really crank the truss rod on this bullet strat here. One more time should do it. That was about a turn and a half on the truss rod. Yeah, and so now if I do the same test, push it down at the first fret, push it down at the last fret, I no longer have any movement. If you could see that before, Now I now have no movement. My high E string will not move. It is pinned down every single fret all the way across. It's sitting tight because now it's a straight chord that's pulled across a surface that curves back. So it's just being pulled down along that backbowed fingerboard the entire way. Okay, how much gap is correct, or is it guitars? Yes, okay, let's talk about relief. So let's talk about numbers and guitar setups. I'm a numbers guy. I really like to measure everything when I set up a guitar. Most players, oh man, almost zero players actually know what numbers they're going for. They're just kind of going by feel. If they do know a number, they usually know how high they want their strings off the 12th fret. This is usually where we measure action. Relief is a measurement very, very few people know. They just know that they need their neck adjusted, and they may know if they like it a little straight or a little relieved. So I'm going to tell you the exact correct numbers. It is different for every guitar. There's a whole bunch of different stuff that affects it, but the recommended relief is different for every guitar. Fender, for the most part, for this guitar, recommends about 0.08 of an inch. I'm sorry to say which, by the way, is about 0.2 of a millimeter. Yeah, I was waiting for that, Randy. So, okay, before we talk about neck relief, you got me, and I was thinking this as I was doing it. All of this stuff really should be done with the guitar in playing position. There is weight and a lot of leverage on the guitar. So if you measure it like this and then turn it like this, it can change some of these adjustments just in the slightest, especially if you're using a neck rest where it's out on the end. The body weight of the guitar is actually pulling the neck down and flexing it more than it would be otherwise. So playing position is the right place to take all your measurements, do all your final adjustments. That said, most guitars, this difference is extremely negligible, so you can usually do most of the setup and even the tuning with the guitar laying flat or whatever's comfortable to you. But yeah, definitely you want to check any measurements, any final checking, any real fine adjustment you're doing should be done in playing position, because ultimately this is how the guitar will be used, unless you're going to go Jeff Healey and play on your lap. Okay, so relief measurements. Fender for these generally recommends 0.08 of an inch. This is always done in thousandths, by the way. And the guitar world is incredibly frustrating that it jumps all over from using thousandths of an inch, 64ths. A few things are done in metric, so unfortunately the units of measurement aren't standardized, but thousandths is about as close we have to a standardized measurement. 0.08 of an inch is generally what Fender recommends you should shoot for. A lot of people like to go straighter than that, down to more 0.06 of an inch. 0.04 of an inch is not that uncommon for guitars. And what I'm measuring, by the way, here when I say that, we're talking about when you have a straight edge or when you're using the string as a straight edge. I'm talking about how much gap is between the bottom of the string and the top of the fret. It is guitar specific. Fender publishes excellent factory specs for all of the guitars they make. It's not model specific, but they publish different specs for the guitars from their basses. Squier is different from Fender. Tellys are different than Jazzmasters. They're great. It's a giant document that you can get. It's available to the public. It gives not only relief specs, but action specs, pickup heights. It's great. And so we use that as a guide. Generally speaking, when you come in for a setup at one of our shops, we'll have a conversation, but if there's nothing special you want, if you just want it done the way Fender does it, we're going to defer to Fender's factory specs. So that 8,000 number is generally a pretty good starting point for guitars. I try and get them a lot straighter than that, personally. Straight necks have a lot of advantages. If you can set a neck straighter and get it playing well, there's a lot of advantages to having your neck more straight, especially on an electric guitar. And you can go down as low, like I said, some people do play with a dead straight neck, in which case the relief would be 0. But 0.02 thousandths, 0.002 of an inch, is about as common as we see. That's usually how I would define a straight neck, is 2 thousandths, even 4 thousandths I would consider to be a pretty straight neck. On the upper end, you can actually get up into above 10, especially for longer scale instruments, for basses. 10, 12, even 14 thousandths would be a lot of relief. But so those are about the numbers. It is instrument specific, and it's personal. It's what the player wants. But Generally speaking, a range from about 8 thousandths up to about 12 thousandths is a pretty good operating range, and I like to go a lot straighter there. One thing to keep in mind, I mean, we're now talking about thousandths of an inch, right? I mean, my thinnest feeler gauge that I have here for measuring this is 2 thousandths, and like this is like a sheet of paper, right? So we're talking about tiny, tiny, tiny little tolerances here, which I hope kind of drives home the point a little bit about humidity, that it may not seem like it should make a big difference if your guitar gains or loses a little bit of moisture, but it doesn't have to move much. You don't have to see much change for it to completely alter the way the instrument moves. I mean, when we're talking about splitting hairs between 7 thousandths and 9 thousandths of relief, just a little bit of humidity change will make a noticeable difference. Okay, so that's relief. Now, generally speaking, you don't want too much relief, right? If it gets, why wouldn't I want more relief on my guitar? Why don't I just have more relief? It fits the travel of the string better. That looks really good. The pictures we put up look good. The waveform of the string perfectly matches the fingerboard. That's obviously great. But you do get into some issues. One thing to understand is that the way the fingerboard's attached to the body, the last few frets are always held much more rigid. The neck doesn't bow in a perfectly even way all across the fingerboard. Even if the truss rod goes all the way up to the very last fret, generally speaking, you're only really getting movement in this section of the neck, the section that is off the body. Most truss rods, really, you're only able to adjust the relief of the neck between the first and usually somewhere on the 14th, 15th fret. So you have this little tail area. It's called usually the fingerboard tongue or the fingerboard extension. On acoustics, this is the part that's glued to the body. As you can imagine on this guitar, when I adjust the neck to bend it more back or forth one way, I can't adjust this part. This is glued to the top of the guitar. I don't want to bend that. I don't want that to start moving around as I turn a screw. It's going to pry itself off. So you don't have total control over the way the neck moves. And it's not even just the way the guitar is built. I mean, this is true for anything that you bend. If you take a ruler and you clamp it at one end and then bend it up, it bends more here than it does at the very end. Towards the end, it's stiffer, it's stronger where it's closer to its terminus, so it just doesn't bend evenly. Another factor to think of, and we won't go too deep on the size. Another thing you have to consider is that this way, the string excursion matching the fingerboard exactly only works on the open string. As soon as you start fretting up the string, now your area of maximum excursion, which is always going to be the center of the string, as you fret further up the fingerboard, it moves. So there's different factors that we have to consider. Oh, we have a question. How long do you wait after a truss rod adjustment to do measurements? Let it settle. Yeah, neck settling. Well, most necks don't really need time to settle. They don't need to be massaged. They don't need to sit overnight. They don't, you don't need to give them any kind of waiting period. When we get a guitar into the shop in Toronto, it comes off the shelf, we set it up. The whole process is basically done beginning to end in one go. The most sitting around that might happen is if the technician happens to take their lunch break in the middle of the setup or something. They're pretty much done beginning to end. And very rarely do we see necks ever slip or move after the fact on us. But it can happen. If the guitar has not been set up in a long time, if I have a guitar in my shop that hasn't been in for a setup, hasn't been played much in, say, 2 years, I might sleep a little better if I adjust the neck, throw it back on the shelf, and come back in the morning and just and do the setup then, just to give it a chance to settle a little bit if it needs to. But I gotta say, I've basically never seen it really be a big factor. A little bit more so on vintage instruments, but generally speaking, once you've got the rod in the position you want, it's usually going to stay there. The only real reasons that anything else would happen is because of wood compression. So that example we showed you with the truss rod here, and other types of truss rods even more so, I mean, this is forcing against the wood, right? Like when I tighten it, it's pressing against the fingerboard, or it's pressing against the neck, usually mainly in two spots, but all along the length of it, it's pressing against the wood to force the wood into the position that it wants it to be in. Well, wood's a natural material. It compresses, it squeezes down. So you might tighten this thing, have the neck in that perfect position, and then over the course of a day or two, the wood compresses and all of a sudden it's not exerting as much force as it was supposed to. That's the theory behind why this happens. In my experience, it's not really something where you're going to adjust the neck, it's looking great, and then a few hours later, all of a sudden, it's out. If that is happening, there's probably something much bigger going on, and you probably want to get in to see an expert immediately. But generally, what we call impacted truss rods, where they've compressed the wood too much, is usually something we see as a result of gross over-tightening, or it's something that happens over the very long term. It's not something that happened because you tightened it and now the wood's all compressed and impacted. It's usually a matter of just over the course of 50 years, slowly the wood kind of rotted away. Can you damage a neck by adjusting the truss rod all the way? Definitely. So yeah, let's talk about over-tightening truss rods. I know this is something a few questions were asked about, and this is what terrifies everybody. So please adjust your neck on your guitar. I really don't see this as being something that any guitar player can't really do. I think if you take up mountain biking, and you're going to go mountain biking up in the hills, you probably want to know how to put your chain back on if it comes off. Maybe even reconnect your chain if it breaks. You probably want to know how to change an inner tube. You probably want to know a few basic repair things, right? Now, it doesn't mean you're going to become a bicycle mechanic, and it doesn't mean you're going to have a big career or anything or do anything crazy, but you shouldn't be afraid to be able to do basic things. And I think personally with guitars that changing guitar strings, restringing is the first thing everyone should learn. But after that, you shouldn't be too afraid of adjusting your truss rod. Now, that said, they're not foolproof. You can damage your guitar in a serious way from adjusting the truss rod, but I think with a few things I'm going to explain now, it should be pretty easy to avoid doing any major damage. So, first of all, there are two kinds of truss rod that you'll see, and I don't have the best example. This is a different type of truss rod that you will see. A single action rod. So this is way simpler. It's just one rod. The way this works is you have a routed channel in the length of the neck. It's anchored at one end, so it's pressing into the wood, and then you tighten it down at the other end. And this doesn't even have the metal bar to push against. It literally is just going to push against the wood. So as you tighten it, it compresses the wood of the neck and forces it to fight back against the string tension. This is what's called a single action truss rod. These are much more traditional, they're older style. I'll just take the camera out a little bit so we can see a little bit better. Point it, there we go. This is an older style of truss rod. This is still used though, these are very effective. This is still used by Gibson guitars. Every single Gibson guitar, acoustic and electric, uses one of these. Taylor guitars uses these. Every single guitar they make has one of these. There are many other manufacturers. Those are just two of the most major. Fender still uses a style like this on their vintage guitars as well. This is historically accurate. I'm going to show you what one of these looks like inside a guitar. Let's pull a Taylor out quickly. First thing is knowing what kind of truss rod you have. There's really only two kinds. So real quick here. More and more truss rods these days are adjusting at the headstock. Generally speaking, it's a little easier to get in there than at the heel end. So most truss rods are mounted to adjust right up here at the headstock. Some of them still do adjust through the sound hole. It can work either way. All right, so let's see here. We want to get in nice and close. Maybe this guy will be the better camera for this. Okay, so give me one quick sec to make sure I can get you a good angle for this. If that will work, maybe not. There we go. Okay, that's what I wanted. All right, so our long truss rod. That's basically what's sitting in here. It's a different end, but this is where, as you tighten the nut down, you're compressing the neck. Tighten that nut down, you're compressing the wood of the neck, and that's what's forcing it into back bow. It's fighting against the string pull. So first of all, this is the type of truss rod that you need to be very confident as a manufacturer that you're never going to have an issue with your neck warping against the string tension. You're always going to be fighting back against it. This truss rod can take relief out of a neck, but it can't put it back in. So it's relying on the string tension to pull that neck up into that little bit of relief that we want, 4 to 12 thou of relief. We're counting on the string tension to do that. This rod only fights against it and to keep it from being too much relief. Whereas our dual action rod that we looked at before, as we saw, this one can actually go both directions. This is what you'll find in Martin guitars, Godin, Yamaha in most cases. Very common. These you do tend to see a little more in acoustic guitars apart from Taylor. You do see them in electric guitars as well. Generally speaking, in terms of determining which one do I have or not, almost invariably, dual action box truss rods like this will have an Allen key, a hex key that is, like this, and that's what you're going to adjust it with, is a hex key. And that may be up here at the headstock, or it may be adjusted down here through the sound hole, which is quite common as well. But this Taylor has a single action truss rod. So I'm going to just take this nut off so we can kind of see what's going on here. Understand this a bit better. Okay, looks pretty good. So this is really the extent of it. This is how a Taylor truss rod works. This is the same as what Gibson uses as well. Straight up, pop this off. Hopefully it's not going to give me too much trouble. Get my other pliers out. Jeez. All right, well, I'd really love to take that washer off so I can show you what I'm talking about here. Just try one last thing. If this doesn't work, we can just move on. Just going to take a little bit of tension off. I think it might be binding it. All right. Let's see if that'll work. There we go. So, all right. Well, this washer's going to fight with me a little bit, so I won't bore you with me arguing with a washer. But basically, behind this little metal washer right here is just the wood of the neck. That's really it. We have this threaded rod that comes all the way. It's anchored right here at the 15th fret on this Taylor. It comes all the way up to the front, and it's just a threaded rod that's cut off. It's threaded about an inch down beyond the wood, so there's more threads buried in there. This washer just presses against the wood to provide a more frictionless turning. But literally all we're doing when we tighten this thing down is we're trying to compress the wood that's in the neck. When you tighten it down, it's just a rod that's anchored at this end, and then we've put a nut on this end so that you can just crank the neck and compress it down. And then, I won't really get into it, but because of the way the channel is shaped where the rod is laid, as you compress it down, the effect is that it forces the neck into back bow. So it's forcing it to fight against the pull of the string tension. So when you balance the 140 pounds of string tension yanking on it against the tightening down the rod, you can wind up in you can actually control how much relief you have. So if you have a truss rod like this, there is absolutely zero harm in loosening it. So if you think your neck might be back bowed, if you're experiencing what we were talking about, where when you hold down the string, it's just contacting all the way along, your neck is back bowed, the guitar seems to be otherwise fine, but the strings have no movement. You're probably also going to experience it as a lot of fret buzz, or maybe just total non-working frets in the first position, in the first 5 frets. If you think your guitar has back bow, there's no relief, you're going to want to loosen the truss rod, right? Loosening the truss rod allows the strings to do whatever they want, right? The truss rod is fighting against string tension, so the string tension will always pull it into relief. Tightening the truss rod fights against that. So if you think you have too much back bow and you want more relief, you want your strings to be able to pull on the neck more, then you want to loosen your truss rod. And there's no harm at loosening it, right? The only thing that'll happen when you loosen a rod like this is that the nut will come off, so just don't lose the nut, and there's nothing you can do there. So if you have a truss rod like this, and this is also what you would see on a Gibson guitar, you can loosen this nut off, and hopefully your guitar will pull itself into relief. So that's if you have this type of truss rod, in terms of like what to watch out for when tightening a truss rod to make sure that you don't break the truss rod, I think is the thing that most people are scared about. Start by loosening it. And with a guitar like this, with a truss rod like this, there's absolutely zero harm in damaging it when you're loosening it. The only way you can potentially harm it is if it is actually seized, if it is rusted and corroded on, and it just can't be freed up whatsoever. In which case, as you can see, and here you're just use some basic mechanical common sense. You can get in around that nut. I'll try and get you a decent enough angle there. Yeah, you can get in to the threads behind the nut actually, and you can try and get in there with a little bit of an anti-corrosion fluid, something like WD-40 or a 3-in-1 oil. Use this incredibly sparingly, astoundingly sparingly, like just a little bit on a Q-tip that you just wick in there a tiny little bit. You can use stuff like that to try and loosen it up if you think you have a corroded or stuck nut, if it doesn't seem to want to turn, right? So those are things you can do there, but this is pretty simple as much as getting any sort of stuck nut off. And as long as you're loosening it, you're going to be safe. Now, generally speaking, the same does go, and maybe let's go back to our overhead camera. The same does go for these kind of truss rods, the two-way adjustable truss rods that generally speaking you're not going to do much damage loosening it, but it is possible to wind them all the way out that you can actually bottom out the threads where it won't turn anymore. This is always a little tough. It is one of those things that you'd learn it in 5 seconds if you're in the shop with somebody and they can show you how much pressure is enough pressure, but it's a little tougher to explain, but I'm going to do my best. Adjusting the truss rod, going back and forth, you can experiment with it, put more relief in, take relief off, but what we don't want to do is we don't want to actually break the truss rod if we over tighten it. If you go too far, and one of a few things can happen. You can just straight up snap the rod. It's just got too much torque on it, it's trying too hard, and you've gone too far and it just snaps completely. You can break the neck sometimes if the neck doesn't want to go any further. It's gone as straight as it can go and it still has relief and you're trying to force it further and the wood just gives up. Sometimes the truss rod comes blowing through the back of the neck or something like that. So, but all of this stuff, you're not going to do that unless you're applying an enormous amount of force to the wrench. So generally speaking, I think if you are making adjustments and you run up against a fair amount of resistance, switch to for me, my left hand. Switch to your bad hand, and just try not to overdo it, and it's very unlikely that you're going to break a truss rod. I've broken a handful of truss rods in my life. I think every guitar technician has done it, but it's pretty tough to break a truss rod on a new guitar these days if you're exercising common sense. So generally speaking, if it doesn't want to turn, try not to force it. If you have access to the nut like you do up here, you can try a little bit of a penetrating oil or a debonder or something like that, and that may help it a little bit, but ultimately you're probably just going to have to put a little bit of elbow grease into it. If you're trying to loosen a nut, especially at a certain point, you got to just try and turn it. If you know you have a good tool that has good purchase on the nut and everything, you've tried penetrating oils and it's just freaking jammed, well, at a certain point we've just got to try and turn it. So don't be afraid to put a little bit of force on there. But again, do it with your left hand, do it with your bad hand. If you're a very, very strong person with an amazing grip strength, take that into account. Try not to overdo it here. So I want to give some more useful feedback as well about knowing what might be going on with your truss rod when you do feel that resistance. Okay, so looking again at this rod here, and maybe we'll use our close-up camera. I want to talk about two types of resistance you may encounter. Remember that when you're adjusting a truss rod, you're turning a mechanical system. So you're dealing with steel and threads and all that. So you're dealing with all the resistance that comes there. If the threads aren't cut very well, if they're rusty, if they're corroded, you have a mechanical system that can get worn out just the same as anything, just the same as the screws on the bottom of your car are probably a little bit difficult to turn. So you have that to deal with, but you also have the actual purpose, what it's doing, which is forcing the neck straight. if you have a very, very bowed neck, a neck that requires a lot of correction, a lot of force, at a certain point, you're just going to bump up against that. Yeah, this nut is hard to turn, not because anything's wrong, but just because it's forcing the neck further than it wants to go. At a certain point, you're trying to bend a piece of laminated hardwood. So, you know, if it's just a matter of how much force it needs to take, that's something where I think the left hand rule of thumb is going to be fine. You're not going to be able to apply enough force to actually snap the wood or snap the internals of the rod. You know, if you're just turning with your left hand in that situation with the piece of wood. And I mean, in the rare cases where that would happen, it was probably hopeless anyways. Like, no, you know, it was bound to happen, right? But there's another kind of resistance you might encounter that is a lot more important. I want you to know how to recognize it if you do encounter it. And I'm going to use this truss rod as my example. So let's say I am tightening this rod down. I'm going to just keep tightening it and keep tightening it and keep tightening it. Now this is a really good truss rod because already that is a huge amount of force it's applying. Now remember, that force would be fighting back against the wood, so it wouldn't be deflected quite that much. But that's already a huge amount of force it's applying. Like, almost no neck would require more force than that. That is so hard for me to turn, even with it held in the wrench. That's already quite a lot of resistance. Like, holy smokes! Like, I wouldn't use that much force on a motorcycle. But look, I have not broken the truss rod. If I'm watching what the neck's doing and making sure that I'm not putting too much relief or too much back bow in it, everything's fine. It's pushing against the wood. The rod is still perfectly intact. And here's the key. I have lots of threads on either side. So I can actually keep going tighter. As I go tighter and tighter, these threads are threading into the actual the tension bar itself. I have quite a bit further I can go. Backing this thing off completely only actually moves my threads a couple of millimeters. So if I back this off completely and I go all the way in the other direction, we can see now I'm going all the way in the other direction, and I kind of the same thing but opposite. Like, I wouldn't want to go any further than that. Like, that's a lot of force, just like it's going to leave a mark in your hand. But still, I still have lots of thread left. So this is a well-made truss rod, and you know, I have lots of thread in either direction. The only thing that's really going to fail me here is if I try and force the wood too far, further than it wants to go, and the wood itself actually fails, which can happen. It's going to be a monumental amount of force. Bring it into a shop and just get a technician to put their hand on it and say yes or no, you can keep going. But generally speaking, with your left hand, less force than a motorcycle, more force than IKEA furniture, you're very unlikely that you're actually gonna break the wood. So okay, so finally, what I'm beating around the bush to is that there's another kind of problem you can encounter. It's a little less common on these box truss rods with an Allen key. You don't see it that much with Allen key truss rods, but where you do see it is on the Taylor style single action truss rod that we looked at before. Not to blame this on Taylor, this is the most classic design, of course, and their necks tend to be extremely well made. So here, the rod that runs all the way down the neck is only threaded for like ½ an inch. The threads actually stop about here. So I can tighten that down, tighten it down, and tighten it down, and tighten it down. But at a certain point, if I keep tightening it, I'm going to actually run out of threads. The nut has nowhere further to go. And now I'm actually pushing up against the end of the threaded portion of the rod. So again, on my one that I have out here, it's got a sheath on it, but there, so, oops. A little hard to see on the black, but you can sort of see where the threaded portion is there. So my nut spins down and down and down, no problem. And then once it hits the unthreaded portion, the part where the threads stop, there we go. I get to the end. Now I can't go any further. I've run out of threads on the rod. So this is as tight as I wanted it to be, and I've run out of threads on the rod. This is different. This is different than forcing a truss rod that has lots of threads as far as you can go. In this, you're just fighting with the stiffness of the wood. It might feel a little scary how much you have to put it, but you're just fighting with the thickness of the wood. With this, your machine has failed. You have run out of threads for adjustment. I still want this thing tighter, but I have run out of adjustment room on the rod. This, I mean, shouldn't happen. There's a reason that rods can't be threaded all the way down. It would greatly reduce their integrity, so they can only be threaded for a short section, and it shouldn't happen. But it does happen over time, usually because of what we were talking about, wood compression. The wood just compresses a little bit, and so as a result, I need to thread this down further than it was ever intended to go. This is not a situation where you want to keep tightening, because if you keep tightening and you've run out of threads, now you're going to start twisting the actual rod itself. I get all the way to the end. I don't have any threads left on my rod. And if I continue to tighten it, it's actually going to twist the entire length of the rod. It's going to start applying force on the anchor at the end, the part where it's connected into the wood of the guitar, and it's going to actually start twisting the rod itself. And if I apply even a half a turn's worth of pressure under this situation, one of a few things is going to happen. Either the rod itself is just going to snap, because now I'm actually twisting the rod in a spiral pattern and it's just going to snap. It's going to break at the end, at the anchor, which is a lot more common. Or what is the most common is that it will actually just break at the nut. You're going to take your tool off and see the nut there with a little broken piece of your truss rod at the end. This is the situation that terrifies everybody. This is what nobody wants to do, and it's why people don't adjust their necks. But there is a way to tell if this is what is happening. There's a way to differentiate if you have run out of threads on your truss rod, or if you are simply dealing with a stiff piece of wood that takes a bit of force to bend. And the way you can tell is the behavior of the wrench you are using. So if you are in a situation where there's threads left on the rod, that piece of wood just is really tough, it's really stiff, it kind of got, it's sort of settled in a bad position, we really have to force it, it's a lot of force. You may find that there's a lot of force required to turn it, but you turn it and it turns and it stays turned. Maybe even sometimes it kind of clicks a little bit, almost like it's like, oh, you really got to like force it ahead. But the point is you make a little progress, you turn it, and it stays in that new position, and then you go take a break and you can come back and grab the rod again and try and turn it a little further if you need to. And that's fine. In this situation, if you have run out of threads at the end, when you go to torque on it with the wrench, I mean, once you've felt this, the truth is you can kind of feel the rod twisting in there, but you don't even have to look out for that. What you'll notice is that the wrench will actually spring back. So if you're like, oh man, this thing's really tight, and you push it forward a little bit and it actually kind of springs back on you, that is a sign that you've run out of threads. Because what's happening, you're not fighting against a stubborn piece of wood that doesn't want to go. You've run out of threads and you're coiling up the rod. You're twisting it, you're forcing it into a spiral, and it's steel, so it's going to return to that same position. So when you get in that position where, I think most people would be comfortable to adjust their truss rods if it was always easy to turn and felt really easy and smooth and you never felt like you were putting any force on anything. Where it gets scary is when you're putting a lot of force on the wrench. So generally speaking, if you're still making noticeable progress, even if it takes a lot of force, but yeah, I can move it a millimeter and the wrench stays moved, you're probably okay. You're just dealing with a really cranky neck that is putting up a lot of resistance. It's a stiff piece of wood. It wants to get bowed. The string tension is pulling it into bow, and you need to apply a lot of force to get the rod into that really cranked position so that it will force the neck straight. But if the wrench springs back, you've actually bumped into the mechanical end of your threads, and if you try and go any further, you are going to snap the rod. So the difference again, this is important, the difference again is whether when you're trying to adjust it and you put that force on it, does it take a lot of force but it goes and it stays? Or does it take a lot of force and when you let go you can actually see it, like you can literally see it spring back and you feel like you've just sort of bumped up against this sort of springy resistance? That's a sign you're at the end of your threads and you're going to break your truss rod if you keep going. So there are solutions in this situation, by the way. The simplest of them is to put a washer on the truss rod nut. I'll just say real quickly, if we go back to this camera here, we can see that there's one washer on this already, which is just to protect the nut against the wood so that it doesn't dig in. But let's say this truss rod ran out of threads. We're in that situation where I'm trying to tighten it down, and as I put my wrench on it to crank it down, it springs back because it's run out of threads every time. What I can do is take the nut off completely and drop another washer in here between the nut and the existing washer. Sometimes you can even stack 2 or 3 if you really have to. And what that does is the washer, it moves it gives you a little more thread to work with. It gives you, what the result is that you can now compress, you can put more tension on the neck without using up all of the threads. So basically, if you've almost run out of threads and you just need like 1 millimeter more threaded rod, if you put a 1 millimeter washer on here between the nut and the actual wood of the headstock, that'll give you that 1 millimeter more of threads. This is very common, it's kosher, it's done in the guitar repair industry all the time. Fender even makes their own washers that they recommend you use on your guitars. It's not a sign that something's wrong, it's not a sign that the guitar is coming to an end of its life. It's just a way to account for a little bit of extra wood compression that nobody could have predicted. And it's the sort of thing, if you identify what's going on and you can feel that spring back, feel the kind of twisting motion in the neck, okay, I know that I have to stop, I have to get a washer on here, or I have to show it to somebody more professional. If you identify that situation when it comes up, you're not going to cause a problem. But if you keep going and push through that, you're guaranteed going to break the truss rod. So generally speaking, that situation applies to rods that have a nut on the end, Gibson, Taylor, that you adjust with a socket driver or with one of the more common little pocket truss rod wrenches, like this. So that applies to all of these truss rods are generally single action, and you do run the risk of running out of threads. If it adjusts with an Allen key, whether at the headstock or at the sound hole, it's probably a double action truss rod. The way these are built, they don't suffer quite as much from wood compression because they have a mechanical reinforcement, so they don't rely as much on compressing the wood to do what they need to do. So it's less common that you actually see these rods run out of threads. Okay, so that's definitely one important thing to keep you from breaking a truss rod. So generally speaking, loosening a truss rod, you run almost no risk. As long as it's not actually seized or rusted in place. If you do see any visual rust or seizing, you can use like a really light penetrating oil to try and loosen it up. You can even use some of the cold spray or something like that, but the truth is we don't see it that much. Generally speaking, this hardware usually doesn't seize so badly. If you have a double action truss rod that you're adjusting with an Allen key, the risks are even lower. You really just need to avoid going too hard. Using the left hand when things get a little bit difficult is generally good advice. One last thing too, most of the time when you're really putting a lot of force leaning onto a truss rod, it's because you're trying to take relief out of the neck. You're fighting against the pull of the strings. You're trying to back bow the neck, right? So as you tighten it down, you are fighting against the string tension. So if you feel like your guitar is real close, you know, you've got 0.8 of relief, but you'd really love it to be 6. You just want it a tiny bit straighter, but man, that wrench really just, there's a lot of resistance and it feels like I'm in danger of pushing this thing too far. Here's one thing you can do. Take the string tension off. Detune the strings, take all the string tension off, and now that's 140 pounds of tension you're not fighting against. Now you're just adjusting the neck with no other forces. And so sometimes if the guitar's up to full pitch, everything's tuned up, and you're trying to tighten it and it just doesn't feel like it wants to go any further, take all the tension off and then try tightening it a little bit more. And you may be able to get just that little bit extra adjustment without feeling like you're putting way too much force onto your guitar. It's another way too, you can kind of test you know, if it's really hard to press and you're not sure what's going on there, take all the string tension off and try it again. If there's no change, it could be a sign that something else is going on. Perhaps you're getting really close to bottoming out on your threads, something like that. I'll talk real quick about tools too. We don't see very many broken truss rods, but we see a lot of stripped out truss rods from people using the wrong tool. Particularly when it is an Allen key, because Allen keys are something that most people have all over their house and usually think they can find the right tool. And it's unfortunately something that, especially since metric and imperial Allen keys are still used in pretty much inexplicably throughout the guitar industry, it's very hard to keep track of who's metric and who's imperial. And they're so close, but not exactly the same. You can often find a wrench that sort of fits, but doesn't really fit. So I recommend talking to the manufacturer to try and get the actual right tool that you need. Very quickly, Taylor guitars all use a 1/4 inch socket driver. This is a 1/4 inch socket driver. That is what all Taylor guitars use. All Gibson guitars use a 5/16 socket driver for the nut up here. For Allen key guitars, for the most part, they are either 4 or 5 millimeter Allen keys. Allen keys tend to be metric. Socket drivers are almost always imperial. 4 or 5 mils is the most common for Allen key adjusted guitars, whether they're at the headstock or at the sound hole. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, they're going to be 4 or 5 millimeters. Call the store, email the manufacturer, give any of our techs a call. We can figure it out for you if we don't know off the top of our heads, but do make sure you have the right size wrench. A lot of guitars come with a truss rod adjustment wrench. It's worth hanging on to. That way you know you have the right size. The other thing too, do not use old tools. Do not use old Allen drivers and old socket drivers unless they're in excellent shape. In some cases, old tools are better than new, but in most cases, especially when it comes to Allen keys, old tools are just old. They get rounded out, they get stripped out. Using a wrench that is even just a tiny little bit stripped out, you can run a big risk of potentially rounding out the actual nut, which in a situation like this on our Taylor guitar where it's this little brass nut, if you strip that out, well, that's going to be a pain in the butt to get off, but eventually we'll be able to either get it off with a tool or we'll cut it off or something, and we can just put a new nut on there and you're fine. But if you have a welded truss rod like this, a double action truss rod, this piece here is completely welded. The nut is welded to the end of the threads. That's how they all work. If you strip out this adjustment, you're kind of screwed. There's not really much we can do. I mean, anything can be fixed. We can take the fingerboard off, we can dig the truss rod out, we can put a new truss rod in, glue your fingerboard back on, refinish the guitar, and $1,000 later you have a working truss rod again. But if you break or strip out an Allen key adjustment on a welded truss rod, which is what's going to be inside if it's a sound hole adjustment, really any Allen key adjustment, that's pretty much the end of it if you strip it out. We do see a lot more stripped nuts. So let's talk about that. So I think actually I may even have a good example here, as I noticed as I was just jumping. Here's 2 Allen keys. These are 2 Fender Allen keys. We may not be able to get a good enough close-up for this to really work, but you may be able to see, these are both pretty much done. These are going in the garbage after we're done here, because they do have a little bit of rounding just at the very tip. You can kind of see it. Yeah, I think without a macro lens camera, it may be tough to see. But use a nice fresh tool. This is the most important advice. This is advice that has stuck with me from ever since when I first started working on things, is that if you ever have a stuck nut, if you're ever about to apply a lot of force to something, if you're ever concerned that this adjustment has to go perfectly, go get a brand new fresh tool out of the package. Allen keys cost like 50 cents. Don't use a worn out one on your nice new expensive guitar. There's a few like kind of squirrely truss rod wrenches that you see out there. I'll just kind of mention them so that they're flagged. First of all, most acoustic guitars do adjust through the sound hole. Taylor's a little bit different. We'll set this aside and maybe just grab a Martin here. Most acoustic guitars, you're going to find the adjustment in the sound hole. So there's this big brace on an acoustic guitar that runs underneath the fingerboard, kind of right at the very end of the fingerboard, called the upper transverse brace. And we can just see it inside there with, here, maybe I can even get a little lower. All right, so it might be a little shaky. I'm just going to hold it. But you can just see what I'm talking about in there. There's this big fat brace, and this runs right across the guitar right here. It's, in a lot of ways, actually the biggest and most important brace in the guitar. And as you can see, they've drilled a hole in it right here that goes through to the truss rod. Okay, so the truss rod adjustment on this guitar, if you want to adjust it, you have to pass the tool through that hole, get down, and adjust the truss rod. The nut is sitting right there. And on Martin guitars, they leave the truss rod adjustment nut quite deep in there. It actually sits right under the 15th fret, I believe, is where the actual adjustment starts. Which means you're not going to reach it with your normal, standard hardware store Allen keys. You just can't get in far enough. You need one of these long Allen keys that goes all the way in before we hit the adjustment right there. So yeah, the nut itself doesn't actually start until about here. So I have to reach way in. So this is a little, there's a whole bunch of structural and design reasons why they do it. That's why we won't get into. But the point is, for Martin guitars, you really need to buy the Martin wrench from Martin. You could go to a higher end tool store or a machine shop and probably find something that was work. But for Martin guitars, you do actually need this extra length to get down in there. Almost no other guitars do it that way. Although these right angle adjustment wrenches are nice to work with, most other guitars from Godin, from Yamaha, the adjustment is nut. They put a longer nut on it. It comes right up to the end, and you can get at it with a regular 4 or 5 mil Allen key. And one last one just for fun. So that upper transverse brace is really quite important. 140 pounds of string tension pulling the neck forward. It wants the guitar to basically pull the neck and collapse it into the top. So if you think about it, the leverage point is right here where it meets the body. All of that force is pushing down on the top, and it's pushing down right here. So that's why they put this big, wide, it's like 5/8 of an inch wide, it's really tall spruce, quarter-sawn spruce brace that goes right here in order to, it's one of the few spines of the guitar, really. It takes an enormous amount of force. And they drill a hole right in the freaking center of it so that you can get your Allen key in there. I've never seen one of these braces actually straight up crack or fail, I feel, because of that hole. I think we've gotten pretty good at building guitars where that doesn't represent a real failure point. But nonetheless, for traditionalists, it's not the way you do it. That brace is very, very important, and drilling a hole in the middle of it just so you can adjust the neck doesn't make a lot of sense. So there's a few companies that have chosen to go a route that avoids drilling that hole, and the most well-known one in Canada is going to be Larrivee. There's another Australian company called Maton Guitars that also does it this way, but we see very, very few Matons in Canada. So they still put the nut in the same spot, and they still have a brace in the same spot. They just didn't drill a hole. So when you go in with your wrench to go get it, you will bump into a brace and there is no hole. So what they designed is a special truss rod wrench that reaches up and around. So if the Martin goes through your hole like that, the silver Larrivee truss rod wrench actually goes around the brace so that there's no need for a hole to be drilled into it, and you can still get the wrench into the truss rod. If you own a Larrivee guitar that was made before about 2 years ago, you need a truss rod wrench like this to adjust it. I encourage you to try and do it yourself, but man, getting that thing in there is really tough if you've never done it before. Once you've worked on 1,000 of them, you get pretty quick at it, but man, getting that thing right, because you can't see what you're doing, right? And trying to get it into the hole is a little challenging, but that's kind of a bit of an oddity from the world of truss rod adjustment. I will say too, Larrivee actually stopped doing this. They've started drilling a hole in the brace, I think because this was such a pain in the butt, but they only started doing that quite recently. So almost all the Larrivees out there have one of these. And if there's anybody out there in Canada who has a Maton guitar that also uses a similar but not exactly the same system, I have 4 Maton truss rod adjustment wrenches in my office in Toronto that we imported from Australia because they're impossible to get here. So if you need your Maton adjusted, I can adjust it for you. Okay, so that's a fair bit about truss rods and about relief. You want relief to allow your strings to vibrate so that they can get full string excursion so that they can play properly. Generally speaking, you want the neck a little bit on the straighter side as opposed to the more relieved side. The problem being is that if you create too much relief, like this is exaggerated here, but going back to our relief example where, and again, this is our fingerboard here, and this just represents our string excursion. If you have too much relief, the problem is when you press the string down here in the very center of the fingerboard, you actually get the effect of having a high spot further up on your neck. You're now pushing the string down in the furthest, deepest spot of the relief, and so now when it goes to vibrate, it actually has in the effect is a high spot. I'm going to draw this one more time to kind of illustrate it because it's a pretty important concept. But if you have a guitar with lots of relief in the neck, and I'm going to draw a super simple guitar If you have a guitar with lots of relief in the neck, looks great, right? That has plenty of room to vibrate, no problem. Problem is when you push the string down at the 7th fret, now your string line looks like this. And so we've created this problematic high point right here because our neck was too relieved. So you can't just have tons of relief in the neck. It would solve a whole bunch of problems. The guitar would play great on the open strings, but you would never be able to play up the neck. If you had a guitar that only had 3 frets and you were never going to play any higher, yeah, you'd put a lot of relief in the neck. That way you could have super duper low action like right here in the very first position. It would have lots of room to vibrate and it would never be an issue. But guitars, we've got to keep moving. So having a straighter neck, kind of as straight as possible, is really advantageous for doing a guitar setup. When we set up guitars in the shop, we generally start by setting the neck really straight, and then we see how much relief we need to put in it to get proper performance. You generally need a little more relief if the customer is playing with a little lower tension. If they're going to be a really hard player, they're going to strum really hard, especially if they're going to strum really hard in open position chords in the first few frets, and they're really going to hit the guitar hard because you need that extra room for extra string excursion if they're going to play really, really hard. Also, too, not all guitars are created equal. Some fingerboards are just a little more perfect than others. This is generally as you go up into higher end instruments, you can get away with setting them a little bit straighter and having everything a little bit lower and kind of tighter tolerances for everything, But if the fingerboard isn't flawless, if there are little high frets in some spots, maybe it's just not perfectly exactly flawless in every way, we may not be able to get everything as close just because of some of that natural imperfection. Again, remembering, we're talking about differences of thousandths of an inch here making a big difference on the guitar. So it doesn't have to be much imperfection to start causing problems. So that's the first aspect of the setup is the guitar relief, and ultimately, or neck relief. And we're trying to get the neck as straight as possible. We should have a fairly small amount of relief in it in most cases. And when you sight the neck, when you look down the neck on a well set up guitar, you should be able to identify just that tiny little bit of curvature in the fingerboard, but it shouldn't really immediately look bowed. It shouldn't look like a big half pipe ramp or anything like that. It should almost look straight, because it is so close to being straight, only a few thousandths of an inch excursion. And when you sight necks too, a few tips for sighting necks. It is good to look at the edges of the fingerboard, along the edges of the frets, because you can get a really good comparison with the string. Again, the string is a flawless straight edge that you can use at all times, right? So the string is straight. And if you compare that to the edge of the fingerboard, it's often a little easier to sort of see relief and see whether your neck is bowed backwards or whether it has proper relief going forwards. And if you're looking for the overall flatness of the neck, maybe you're worried you have a high fret or that it's warped or waves or the neck has done something weird, wood warps, right? So if you're worried that it's done something strange, rather than looking at the edge, look at the tops of the frets. Actually hold the guitar, raise and lower, and look at the top of the frets. This is a much better way to see things like twist and warp and funny business and fret, high frets, things like that. They'll jump out to you a lot more if you're looking over the actual playing surface. So I hold the guitar like this, where I'm looking right down the neck, and I can basically just see the tops of the frets, and then you kind of raise and lower it a little bit, and you can get a really good concept for how straight, symmetrical, and untwisted it is. And it should, to the untrained, it should basically look flat to an untrained. If you see something that's like, oh, it seems like that's really popping up there, you may actually be onto something. Your eyes are pretty darn good. We do always get optical illusions, especially with fancier guitars with binding and inlay and more visual stuff going on. So I always go back to straight edges or using the string to measure relief. I'll always trust the numbers and the measurements more than my own eyes. My eyes get tired and the guitar can play tricks on my eyes. So that's sighting necks, that's neck relief. The next thing we do need to look at a little bit is neck angle. I'm just going to talk really quickly about this. And the question was asked about a neck reset. So if we have our neck, basically straight or properly adjusted, now the only thing now that we really have to worry about is our string height, right? We have the proper relief. How high or low do we want our strings to be? And so this is mostly going to be controlled at the saddle. We can bring strings up or down at the nut, but we can bring them up or down at the saddle as well. And most adjustments, the majority of the adjustment happens going up or down at the saddle. So on an acoustic guitar, it's a pretty simple process, really. Like, let's say the neck is properly adjusted, everything is great. Now we want to actually adjust the nut and saddle down. In this case, we would actually take this white piece here, the saddle, and we would actually physically grind it down, sand it down with sandpaper, grind it down on a grinder, and lower it to get lower action. If we want it to be higher, we would take this out, throw it away, and put a taller piece in here, an actual taller saddle. So we're physically going to raise or lower the break point of the strings at the bridge end, and that's how we're going to control action. But we don't have infinite adjustment. Obviously, I can only lower this thing down a little bit before it can't go any lower. It's only sitting up about, let's see here. That doesn't really matter that much, but it's only, we're only about, geez, in this case, it's only about 1/8 of an inch above the bridge. So if I have really high action, I want to bring it way down, I'm just not going to be able to go any lower. Likewise, height. You can't put an infinitely tall saddle in an acoustic guitar. The saddle is applying leverage to the bridge. The taller it gets, the more leverage it has on the top. And if you go much taller, if you say doubled the height of this saddle, it'll be so much leverage that it's going to break the front of the bridge off completely, or it's going to rip the top to pieces because it's just too much leverage, too much force. So the room for adjustment I have here is really quite narrow. I can only go a few millimeters up or down in either direction before I'm just out of the range of adjustment. So this is where neck angle comes in. If your guitar, for the standard player, as long as you don't want something that's totally off the map in terms of string height, guitars are built to accommodate the standard range of playability, from someone who likes very low string height to very high string height. They set it in a nice middle position so that it'll generally make everybody happy. But if this neck angle isn't set properly, right? Like if the neck points, this is our neck, if it points a little too high or a little too low, this glue joint here, when it's glued onto the body, if it's too high or too low, it's going to affect what I can do here. Right? So let's say, again, let's say I really wanted to raise raise the action up on this guitar. I can put a taller saddle in it, but at a certain point, I can't go any taller. But if I had a lower neck angle, if the neck was tilted more like this, it's going to have the effect of raising my string height. Now, maybe it wasn't the best place to go with that explanation. The point is that the neck angle has to be correct. It needs to be pointing right where it's supposed to be pointing in order for us to be able to do our adjustments. If you have a really tall neck angle where the fingerboard is pointing up here, there's no saddle you're going to put in that's tall enough to get your strings up to the right height. Likewise, if your neck angle is pointing down really low, there's no saddle you're going to get that's low enough to actually get your strings down low on the fingerboard. So it all has to work together. This neck joint has to be shooting exactly where the builder intended in order for us to be able to get the adjustment that we need. And the same's true on electric guitars, right? This Telecaster has adjustable saddles that I can raise up and down super easy. I don't even have to do any woodwork. But the same principle applies. If my neck angle is so low that the saddles would have to go down low through the body and down be somewhere in the middle of the body, I'm not going to be able to get it set up. So the neck angle and the set of the neck, and this is what we call neck set, is critical. This is why if you learn to build guitars, you spend your first month building the guitar and then your second month setting the neck. At least if you're doing acoustic guitars. This is something that really takes years to master. Even grandmaster luthiers who do neck resets, where they take the carpentry apart, rebuild the joint, reset it at the correct angle. People who've done hundreds of them still have issues, have to go back and forth. It's still a long process. It's extremely difficult. It's probably about apart from finish repair, it's probably about the highest calling in lutherie is resetting acoustic guitar necks. It's a very precise joint. It's probably one of the most challenging joints in woodworking. Well, without getting too esoteric. So real quick, what should my neck angle be? Okay, so first of all, this relies on your neck being relatively straight, first of all. If the neck is a wavy, crazy roller coaster that's warped and twisted and been soaked in the bathtub for 2 years, you're never going to be able to get a good assessment of the neck angle. But let's say your neck is, in relatively good shape, and you've adjusted the truss rod so that it's pretty much straight, close to straight, little bit of relief. I mean, you want the truss rod adjusted to where you're going to play it, but it should be pretty close to straight. Having a lot of relief will screw this up. But if the neck is basically straight, and again, the point goes again that this all kind of should be done in playing position, but I think you get a much better view if I do it this way. If we use a straight edge on our straight neck, that straight edge sitting right on the tops of the frets should come right along, and at the bridge, maybe I can get it even a little lower. Yeah, it's a little tough to see, but the bottom of my straight edge, it runs all the way along the fretboard, along the top of the frets, and then it just touches the top of the wood. So not the saddle, it's not up here on the saddle, it's actually on the wood of the bridge. And so that height that the saddle adds to get the strings up just a little bit higher, that's the only, that's the gap that's separate, that's determining how much the strings are off of the frets. So this is a perfectly set neck on this Martin. If we did this test and we saw that my straight edge was, here, I'll hold it right there. If we did this test and we saw that my straight edge was coming in like that, I'm just going to try and angle this so we can get you the best possible view of this. There we go, if we line it up perfectly. Okay. So, and let's try that. Okay, that's where we are right now. Perfect. That's exactly what you want. The straight edge is just bumping up a tiny bit when it hits the wood of the bridge there. So the top of the plane that the top of the frets create is going right to the top of the wood. Now, if this were my straight edge were coming in and bumping into the bottom of it like that, that would mean I have a low neck angle. If it was coming in and it was shooting above the wood of the bridge, that would be a problem. Okay. You can cite this as well, just by looking at it. Now that you know what we're looking for, just again, looking along the tops of the frets, just imagine a straight plane from the tops of the frets shooting, and it should basically arrive around the top of the wood of the bridge, not the white saddle piece, but around the wood of the bridge. The top of the frets should form a fairly straight plane that intersects right at the top of the bridge. Look at enough of them, and you'll start to see it pretty easily. So there's a question here from Matt, and I think if I understand, he's talking about neck alignment. The most difficult joint in carpentry, I'll say it again. So you got to get that angle perfect. And by the way, you do that by sanding down little pieces of the neck heel here, this like absolutely flawless joint where you can't even see there's a joint. That was all, that all had to be controlled down to the last degree to get the neck angle correct. But there's also neck alignment, which is your neck straight like that, or is it cocked to one side like that, or cocked to one side like that? So you actually have to get this joint correct in two ways at the same time. The best way to check if your neck is in proper alignment is to use the outside strings, the high E strings, and confirm that they're basically an equal distance from the fret ends, from the end of the fingerboard all the way along. So you should see an equal and even amount of gap between the string and the end of the fretboard all the way up. If it's cranked a little bit to one side, like if you do have the neck cranked a little bit like that, you'll notice that the low E string is very, is maybe further away from the edge of the fingerboard here, but then up here it's completely falling off the fingerboard. If you often get this problem where you go to play and it goes off the side of the fingerboard, that could be a case of the neck actually not being squared up. We don't see this issue as much anymore on acoustic guitars. you know what they do is they wait until the neck's glued on to glue the bridge on. In a lot of cases, not every manufacturer, I mean a lot of manufacturers do, just so that they can make sure they get that exactly right. So even if the neck is just tiniest little bit off by 1,000th of a degree, that's fine. They can just move the bridge off by 1,000th of a degree to make sure that it's in exactly the right place. The truth is this is all done with jigs and machinery now that make sure that these problems don't happen. But sometimes you can see that over time. That's another effect of lack of humidity over time, is that it puts a lot of stress on this joint. When guitars dry out, there's a big internal block here, a big block of hardwood. It's the biggest single block of wood that's squared up still in the guitar, and that's what the neck is glued into. It's a big giant, it's like the sternum of the guitar. It so much rests on it. When guitars dry out, that block dries out, it sucks everything in with it because so much is glued to it with so much surface area, it's the last place that wants to give up. So that whole cube of wood in there shrinks and it sucks everything in with it, including the neck. It sucks the heel in and it usually pitches the neck angle up. A dried out guitar is very, very common that you will see the neck pitch upwards if the guitar is getting dried out. But also, and the reason I bring it up, is that sometimes one side of the block will dry out faster than the other, or it'll just it'll have less resistance and you'll start to see the neck pitch to one side or the other. You do see that as well too. One last kind of thing for neck angles. That thing is very real on acoustic guitars, especially when they dry out. The dryness, it sucks the heel in and the neck tends to pitch up. So when you sight it, when you look down it, you're going to see that it looks like it's shooting up above the bridge. If you hold a straight edge on it like this, you're going to see that it comes in much higher above the saddle. That's on a dry guitar. And the effect that has is that you generally have really low action or just complete buzzing, right? Because if you think about it, you've got, your strings have lots of room to buzz here like this now, but as we bring the fingerboard up and the bridge stays in the same place, now they're going to start buzzing and you're going to get low action and buzzing. And then that's of course compounded by the fact that if the guitar's drying out, the top is probably sinking too. So it's a terrible situation. The heel is getting sucked in, the neck angle is pitching up at the same time that the bridge is actually sinking down. They're running away from each other. So very telltale signs, very, very basic stuff, good dimension off the top. Dry guitars tend to have low action and they buzz terribly. Wet guitars, over-humidified guitars, tend to have high action. They sound really tubby, but they're just super high action and you can't really do much with them. There's other things that kind of compound that. It's not true 100% of the time because truss rods do weird things under humidity, but generally speaking, over-humidified guitars, it swells up, it actually forces the heel out, and you get that neck angle pitching down. On dry guitars, it pitches up. Okay, so neck angle, if you have a guitar like this or a guitar like this, Martin or Gibson, on all of Martin's Nazareth American-made guitars, get it right, they all have glued in neck joints. Some of them do have a bolt that's used, a clamping bolt, but they're all glued in. Gibson, 100% of Gibson guitars are glued in more dovetail neck joints. So it is a glued carpentry joint. Getting the neck angle corrected on one of these guitars is extremely expensive and extremely time consuming. But that's not true of all guitars. Because this problem exists, some guitars it's much easier to correct the neck angle. Taylor guitars, this is a big advantage. I'm not going to rip it all apart right now. Taylor makes the best videos and they've got lots of great videos about how this works. Their necks are much more adjustable. They're held together with bolts, it's not a glue joint, so it's very easy to take apart. They've done a bunch of stuff to make it very easy to reset the neck angle. So to give you an example, if you bring this guitar or this guitar into my shop looking to have the neck reset, you are in for a $500–600 proposition. If you have a Taylor that needs its neck reset, $75 flat rate, you can have it today. Like, very, very, very simple. So different. Now, I mean, there's trade-offs there. It's certainly trade-offs in tone. It's nowhere near traditional. The trade-offs in tone are debatable for sure. As a technician, I absolutely love resettable necks. I love what Taylor's done. It's always great if we do have a neck angle issue, if it's something that we can easily fix, because of course, you know, the prospect of spending $600 and maybe not having your guitar for a few weeks or a month, getting it reset is a lot different than just changing the shim set and realigning your Taylor. And then electric guitars, Electric guitars are really the best because they're almost all easily resettable. Let's talk about how you reset the neck angle on a Fender guitar really quickly. So I have a question, is there any reason for wanting high action? Sure. Basically, the reasons why you would want high, so there's a few. One reason some people like high action, there is an argument that higher action gives you better tone. That's I think the simplest answer. Why would you ever want high action? Oh, well, tone. But that's a complicated question. So first of all, on acoustic guitars, there's a real thing there, which is to raise the action. For the most part, on acoustic guitars, if you're happy with the relief, raising the action means raising this saddle, right? Increasing its height. Remember what I said about leverage. So if you raise it too high, you're going to break the bridge or break the top or break the guitar. But you can raise it a bit before you get to that point where it's still playable, where it's still functional and everything's still all kosher, but you've increased the leverage on the top. So having that higher saddle in there is going to actually pull more tone out of it. It's more, the string tension is applying more leverage to the top. It's going to drive the top more. You're probably going to get more volume, more punch, more tone. That's not a linear thing either, though, of course, because a guitar top, oh man, now we're getting into voicing, but guitar tops do need to be able to vibrate. If you put them under maximum tension and they're just so rigid and stuffed full of tension that they can't vibrate, that's not good either. But generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, more leverage, more input, higher tension is going to drive more volume and more tone. So especially you'll see that in the bluegrass world, you actually have people buying, well, they love vintage guitars, but taking guitars that have perfect neck angles, maybe a brand new guitar, and actually asking to have the neck reset so that they can get a higher saddle in it. You do see that, right? So actually having it adjusted away from what would be correct according to Martin, just so that they can get more leverage out of the top. There's other and better ways to do that, but that's a factor. So that's one thing, just simple, tone on acoustic guitars. But on electric guitars and on all acoustic guitars too, having higher action lets you hit the strings harder. Oh, I'm so glad that this question got asked. Okay, a very important thing I need to draw for you right now is the triangle of guitar setups. Okay. So let's see if I can get this right. So we are going to have low action over here. Low action, nice low strings that are close to the fingerboard, easy to play, easier on your fingertips. Then in this corner here, we are going to have clear sound. So what I mean here, I don't mean, a functionally, a functional sound. I'm talking specifically about fret buzz. Can you, are you getting lots of buzz on the frets, or are the strings ringing nice and clear? And then finally, up here, we have hard. My pen is starting to die on me, but I think I have a spare somewhere. It went missing. Okay, well, we'll just write with the pen that's, that's okay. Hard strum, or pick. Okay, so the triangle of guitar setups. You have low action, you have nice clear sound when you pluck the string, and you have hard strumming, hard picking, the ability to play hard. As a musician, you can pick two, but you can't pick all three. So high action allows you to strum really hard because your strings just have more room. They're way up above the fingerboard, and you can haul back like a bow and arrow and let go and let that thing vibrate like crazy, and it's got lots of room and it's not going to hit the frets. As you lower the string down now, if you keep plucking it really hard, now it's getting closer to the strings, it's going to start hitting the string, you're going to get fret buzz, it's going to zing, sizzle, all the kind of way we describe it. You're going to start getting fret buzz, which is 90% of what we're doing in setups is trying to avoid fret buzz. As you bring the action down. So if you have high action, the string has lots of room to move, it'll ring really clearly, and you can hit it as hard as you want. So that would be choosing these two. I'm going to have a nice clear sound, and I'm going to play really hard with this thing, but I can't have low action. So that's why you would want high action. A rhythm player, a bluegrass player, somebody who really just likes to chop it out in their band. And I'm speaking mostly in the acoustic world, but this is true in the electric guitar world too. If you're playing rhythm guitar and you just really need the punch, you need to be able to hit your guitar really, really, really hard, you need to have high action or else you're going to get some buzzing. So you can pick any two of these, right? You can have low action and a clear sound. You can have a crystal clear sound with no buzz and low action. Remember what I said about the thing every player wants is low action with no buzz? That's what this is, low action, no buzz. You can have that, but you can't hit it that hard. You can't strum that hard. And I mean, ultimately, you know, I mean, this is, the strumming thing is tough because that's the only one that we don't really measure objectively, right? Action, we're going to measure with a number. Clear sound is fairly off or on. Is it buzzing or isn't it? But how hard can I hit it? I don't know. I can't tell you how many newtons of force you can apply to the side of a string before it's reasonable for it to start buzzing. But, you know, taken in abstract, this is basically the trade-off that everyone makes when they set up a guitar. So you can have low action and a clear sound, but you gotta play softly. We can set up guitars for people at 1/3 the string height of what the manufacturer recommends. So low, like I play these things and I can't believe it. Like I breathe on it and it's buzzing. But the customer will come pick up their guitar, she'll start playing it, and it's crystal clean. Zero buzz, because that's the touch that player has, and they're able to play the guitar without making it buzz, right? So this is where the important thing is that it comes in is that the low action, the clear sound, those are sort of the objective things the technician can control. How hard you play it, how hard you want to strum it, that's up to the player, and that's often the big barrier of a tech getting your setup right. You know, I mean, some techs do a better job than others, some are more conscientious than others, and I've certainly met some guys that just seem to be magic. But for the most part, I think most issues with, I don't like the way he sets up my guitar, or the person at this store always does an amazing job, or I've used the same guitar tech for 20 years. A lot of times it's because you've managed to communicate and you see eye to eye on how you play and how you're going to use it. When and where you're going to hit the notes hard, when and where, how high action you can tolerate. There's so many factors, and once the technician, I think, really understands your play style and is willing to adjust what they do to meet your needs, then you know that's when you're really going to get a really good setup. So once again, you can get a clear sound and you can strum really hard, but you'd have to have a high action. That's why you would want that. You can have low action and a clear sound, but you're not going to be able to strum hard. And then finally, you can have low action and you can strum hard, but you're not going to have a clear sound. It's going to buzz like crazy. So a lot of times, really, when everyone wants low action, no buzz, you know, my kind of textbook answer is, well, frankly, every guitar buzzes and I can make any guitar buzz, and you give me a guitar and I'll make it buzz. Because if I strum hard enough, you can make any guitar buzz. So it's really a matter of finding out how much buzz, we're going to set the action as low as possible. We have to find out how much buzz you can tolerate so that we know where to set it. Now, the important thing before you get into that whole thing is that you understand all the other weird stuff that can be going on, and you know that the fingerboard doesn't have high frets, and you know that the neck isn't twisted and that the nut's not miscut. So we have to check a whole bunch of stuff to make sure something else isn't going on. But if everything else is right with the guitar, this is basically what it comes down to. It's just what you want to pick. And one thing I guess I would say that brings all of these a little closer together and makes the triangle a little bit smaller is precision. The better the guitar is made, the more accurate the fretwork, the more level the frets are, the closer you can get to having all three of these. You'll never really get all three, but the closer you can get. So, you know, a guitar that's just had the frets freshly leveled, a guitar that's really been deluxed and had everything make sure that it's as perfect as possible, you'll be able to get a lot closer on all these things. Okay, so that's a reason why you might want high action. How are we doing for time? Still go a little longer?
Sure, we're at 3 hours.
Yeah, okay, all right. Well, I'll go a little bit longer. There's a couple things. I wanted to talk about strings. I wanted to talk about intonation. So we didn't really talk about resetting neck angles, but suffice it, basically, it's pretty straightforward, but I've already got this one down tuned, so I will show you, because I think we know what we'll find in here. So neck angles on bolt-on neck guitars are super easy. All right, so quite literally, it's a rental. All we're going to do is pop the neck out of the pocket. Okay. So,
On Fender guitars, this one is a totally blank pocket, so they felt comfortable with the neck angle when they built the guitar. It is very common to find a piece of cardboard sitting right here. It's like literally from a matchbook or a business card that's taped right here. That will pitch your neck angle up. Less common, you'll also sometimes see one taped here at the front of the pocket. That pitches your neck back. This is how Fender has controlled neck angle for basically their entire history by using paper shims. You can use wooden shims. We can make you custom shims that fit the pocket exactly. We can make you a shim out of maple so that it matches the material of your neck. But Fender, from the factory, including vintage spec or custom shop guitars, will have cardboard shims that actually control the neck angle. So don't get too alarmed if you see one of those inside your guitar. It's very common. It's used throughout the industry. You see sandpaper sometime. Now let's talk about micro tilt. So this is something probably a lot of people do have, and that's a good question. I do have a guitar with micro tilt. Yeah, so a few years back, Fender came up with an even better solution, which I do like. This is a micro tilt neck. So as you can see, it's got a little hole in the neck plate here. And I can put a wrench in there, 1/8, and I can adjust the neck angle by tightening it. So all this does is it has a little grub screw in there that pushes on the actual neck itself. So as I tighten it, it pushes the neck up, or if I loosen it, it relaxes and lets the neck go back down. So you have to loosen the neck bolts when you're working on this, loosen the neck bolts, and then you can tighten or loosen this screw to adjust the neck angle, and then tighten the bolts back down. It's the easiest neck angle to adjust, unless you get much better setup. Okay, so as expected, I have gone way over time on all the basics, so I want to make sure I answer everybody's questions. So I want to talk real quick about intonation and about strings. And if you had any questions on restringing, we have a whole series of videos on restringing where I show you how we do it in the shop, so I direct you towards those if you just want to see how we restring a guitar. Talking real quick about guitar strings and about intonation and where they intersect. Guitar strings are probably the most overlooked aspect of intonation. If you're having intonation issues, so there's a big conversation with kind of, I understand the basics of intonation, but my guitar still doesn't play in tune. I intonated it so that the open string and the 12th fret all seem to play in tune, but it's not in tune in the first position. There was a lot of questions about that. I actually just got an email this morning right before walking in here from one of my techs having some trouble with a dulcimer that wouldn't play in tune. I think most overlooked fact is how much string gauge and string tension do affect intonation. Try the guitar with the strings that the manufacturer recommends. You'd be surprised how much it matters. Guitar strings are all different tension. They all generally range somewhere between 12 pounds and 22 pounds of tension is about the most any guitar string is under. That's going right from the low E to the high E. They're all somewhere in that range. But even if you're sticking with the same gauge of strings, like I always play 10s or I always play 12s or whatever, the wound strings between brands, between manufacturers vary quite a bit. Depending what thickness of core wire they're using versus the thickness of wrap wire will really change the tension, the functional tension that the guitar is under, which affects intonation. Tension affects intonation. So that's one thing I would say too, is if you're using a really off the map gauge of strings, or even just an unusual brand of strings and you're having tuning issues, especially if perhaps you've had intonation issues that are turning up just after changing them, do look at that and see if you can maybe try it with a different set of strings, something that the manufacturer recommends. There is a question about, is it possible really to get my guitar in perfect tune? Is intonation possible? Is it possible to get perfect intonation, or will I always have to compromise a little bit? The answer is, okay. For the answer, I'm going to read a quote from Dan Erlewine, who's one of the many American godfathers of guitar repair. There's no one more authoritative than Dan on guitar setup, manufacturing, and repair. And this is what he says. To begin with, accept the fact that fretted instruments play in tune only to a point. They're not perfect and never will be. With its fixed position frets, the guitar is known as an even-tempered instrument. The fret positions are a compromise that enables the guitar to play closely in tune in every key, but not perfectly in any. Many players can hear the out-of-tune notes in the even-tempered scale, and it drives them crazy. And that is the truth. So guitars can play in any key. They don't just play in G and they don't just play in C. They can be tuned a whole bunch of different ways. We have, and I'm speeding this up a lot here, but over the years of development, the centuries of development of the guitar, we've come up with a scale that is the best compromise so that you can play in every key and have it be pretty close, but it's not perfect in any key. In order to get a perfect, flawless intonated guitar, you would first of all need to control for every aspect of the setup. It can only be set up with a certain amount of relief, a certain string height. It can only be set up with a specific gauge of strings at a specific tension, and all of the frets would have to be in different places. Put up this picture of number 10. True temperament necks. So, I mean, this exists. True temperament necks are wild. I mean, but they're out there. I mean, this is what a guitar neck looks like that could conceivably have perfect intonation. You have to tune it in standard tuning, though. This thing will be terrible if you try and use alternate tunings. You have to use the gauge of strings with, you know, that's recommended within reason. But this is a guitar where everything's been corrected so that every note will musically play in tune on this guitar neck, in theory at least. But as long as you stick very, very rigidly to the setup and the string choice and everything like that. Most guitar necks do not look like this. These things are a nightmare to try and maintain, to try and set up. Personally, I wouldn't really want to own one outside of the gimmick just because of the maintenance, but I am also not that picky. If you really do care about intonation, you could pursue something like this. This is truly the key for flawless intonation. At the end of the day, guitars are a bit of a compromise. Okay, a few really important things for people that are intonating their own guitars. One thing that got brought up was it's going out of tune in the first position. I got it pretty well intonated across the neck, but I'm having problems in the first position. Look at the nut is my best advice to start. If the break point on your nut isn't at the front, it's going to screw everything up. Okay, I'm going to go to my, oh, do I have a sheet rock? All right, well. You skipped one earlier. Oh, do I have an extra piece? All right. All right. Fingerboard, nut, string. So, the absolute terminus is supposed to be right here. This is where the speaking length of your string, or the sounding length of your string begins. That's the absolute most important point. This is your nut. You have a nut slot that's filed in there that should be kind of rounded away to give you nice smooth string movement so that your string moves through, and the highest point should be right here where the fingerboard begins. Sometimes a nut is not cut properly. Sometimes it was cut properly to begin with, but the string slowly wore it away. And now you have a situation where that string slot is kind of like this. So now when your string comes over it, it's now exiting, it begins vibrating. The free portion of the string starts here instead of here. If you know anything about intonation, you know why that's going to create a huge problem. Your fingerboard was designed for a string that is this long, but instead you're getting a string that is now longer than it should be, and that is a problem. So look at the nut. If the nut isn't dressed flawlessly, there's no point in even starting to intonate the guitar. The nut is the heart of the setup in a lot of ways. You really need to make sure that the strings are breaking in the proper point, especially if you are getting the issue of it's in tune at the 12th, but it seems sharp in the first position. It's usually something like this. A few other things. I generally would recommend, if you're going to compromise when you're doing intonation, there's a lot of different theories. The 12th fret makes a lot of sense. That's where a lot of people start. But if you're compensating for the 12th fret, understand that's also the point of like maximal stretching. When you press a string at the first fret, you are almost stretching it not at all. You're adding very, very little tension because the action's so low at the first fret. It hardly has to move at all when you press it down, right? So you're not stretching the string much and you're not throwing it out of tune much. But as you move up the neck, now you're really stretching the string quite a bit because it's much higher at that point. You're stretching the string more and that's what's sending it out of tune. So when you intonate for the 12th fret, you're going to get better behavior up here, but you're you're moving the saddle back, you're solving a problem in the first fret that doesn't really exist as much. By compensating for the 12th, you're really overcompensating for the first, second, and third frets. So to some extent, how are you going to use the guitar can determine where you want to optimize for. If you only ever play in the first 5 frets, who cares what's happening above that? Intonate it for the first 5 frets. Intonate it so that you can get your D chord to sound properly. And if you're never going to play at the 15th fret, who cares how it sounds? So you can sense the fingerboard is a compromise to begin with. And any intonation we do is a compromise, unless you have one of those true tempered necks. You're compromising anyways. Compromise around how you're going to play it. Second of all, if you have to pick when you're compromising, intonate it a little on the low side. Intonate it so that it's a little flat rather than a little sharp is generally my advice if you have to pick one. Because you can push a note sharp. You can apply more pressure. You can get vibrato. You know, this is how you do vibrato in the classical world. Just by applying more pressure with a stronger grip, you can force the note a little bit sharper. You can bend a string and force it a little bit sharper. If you're in the middle of the perfect note in your solo and it's just coming through a tiny bit flat because the intonation's off, you can push it up and make it a little bit sharper. But you can't bring it down. You can't take tension off your strings. The only way to take tension off a string is to detune it at the tuner. But everything you do when you're playing, strumming and fingering, you can add tension. So you can actually nudge it upwards. So that's another piece of advice for intonation. There was a question about grinding down saddles or actually, so it wasn't a question about grinding down saddles, but that's what I'm going to talk about. What do I do if I've got my low E all the way back and it still needs to go back further? This, you may not be crazy, this is something we do see a lot. The low E generally requires the most compensation. That's why guitar bridges are angled, because the low E string has the most mass and it bends, it stretches the most up in pitch, and so it requires the most extra length. As you go up in gauges, especially, it requires even more compensation. So if you're, anyways, the result is that often you have to take this saddle back all the way as far as you can go. And as you can see here, it's actually cranked all the way back and it can't take it back any further. So there's 2 things you can do. Number 1, you can undo the intonation screw completely and you can pop the spring off. So you don't even actually need to take the string off to do this, but let's say I want to get this saddle back just a tiny bit further. I can actually just take this spring out. I mean, the spring is largely there to keep it steady, to keep it from rattling loose, but you're going to crank it all the way back, so it's going to be forced against itself anyways. So right there, by doing that, I gain myself another millimeter or 2 of compensation. One last thing you can do, don't do this until you have explored all other options, but on a Fender style saddle like this, you've got a little bit of room left here at the end of this saddle. You could pop this off and you can grind a little bit off the end of this saddle. You can, and that will allow it to go even further back. You can't do much, but you can take a millimeter or so off. Some imported instruments, especially, this area is a lot bigger and you can grind more off, but you can literally just take this onto a belt sander, do it with machine tools so that you can actually get it flat, and you can sand it down. You've got pretty, the threads actually pass all the way up into this saddle, so you could actually grind almost all of this back end off here without really doing any violence to the guitar. And that's another way that once it's ground down, that will allow you to now pull it back even further and get it even further back. Lower tunings, lower pitch notes require more compensation. If you are trying to do drop tunings on a guitar that's not designed for it, if you're on a regular scale length guitar that's meant to be played in concert pitch and you want to take it down a step or 2 steps or God help you even further than that, you're going to run into intonation issues, especially in the low strings. It's just not designed for it. It's going to be very difficult. This is why basses have longer necks, because there was no way we'd ever be able to get the intonation right on a guitar scale length bass. And you can get it close now, but this is why baritone guitars have a little bit more length. At the end of the day, the scale length of the guitar, the size the guitar is, really is is determined by the key that we wanted it to play in. If we wanted the guitar to play a lot lower, it would have a much longer neck. So baritone guitars, alternate tunings where you're bringing the tuning way, way down, you're going to have to accept some compromises because it's just not designed. It's just not designed for those frequencies ultimately. So there always will be a little bit of a trade-off there. The nut, again, is the biggest kind of like pro tip I have, I think. You can get into compensated nuts as well. There's actually a picture of it that I have for, yeah, number 12 of a compensated nut. This is what, like Music Man does this on their new instruments. You can buy, there's a whole bunch of different aftermarket compensated nuts, which help improve the tuning a bit too. Without getting too technical, we only do compensation at the bridge. We don't do compensation at the nut. So we're making the string longer, but we're moving the whole, we're not moving the fingerboard, right? So it's complicated. This could practically be its own video, but compensated nuts allow you to, they still keep the low E as far forward as possible, but they move the high E back a little bit. It allows you to compensate less at the bridge, and it can generally improve things. There's all sorts of alternate intonation systems. The True Temperament is one. There's the Buzz Featon system as well that moves the nut up. I could do a whole separate video on alternate intonation systems, but yeah, inspecting the nut, making sure the nut's working properly, making sure you have the correct string set, and then finally, it's the last piece of the setup too. If your action is way too high, you're stretching the strings more when you press them down, so they're going to intonate even further sharp. If the action at your nut is really, really high, but otherwise fine, then you're going to be stretching it a lot more in that first position than the guitar was really designed for. So intonation is always the last step. You should really only do it after you are super happy with the way the guitar plays. When I set up a guitar in my shop, I set up everything. I do the play test, and then I do the intonation. Because the last thing you want to do is spend all that time getting the intonation perfect, and then go back and play test and find that you've got some problem that you need to resolve and end up changing the relief slightly, changing the action slightly, raising or lowering a nut slot, because that's just going to affect everything else with the intonation. So intonation should always be the last step, even after the play test, really. All right, so I'm just looking over the questions that were asked on Facebook. I think I got to most of them. There was a little bit about Floyd Rose stuff that I just didn't really get to, unfortunately. If there's any questions that haven't been asked, ask them now. Let's get any final questions, because my throat's starting to get dry. And yeah, I'm just reviewing. Okay. Oh yeah, yeah, go for it. The super glue baking soda thing's fine with that. Oh right, yeah, sorry, we have a time lag. So question is there a way to repair a plastic nut with a pretty worn out slot? Super glue and baking soda sounds okay, though I'm not sure. Yeah, the super glue and baking soda thing I think is a little unseemly. We do it in our shop sometimes, rental guitars, stock instruments. We see it as like an affordable option for people sometimes, so we do it usually as part of a setup just quickly and stuff. It does seem to work fine. I wouldn't shy you away from doing it. We have a way more sophisticated system that uses UV cure dental filling. Like we have an account with a dental supply company, and we get the same stuff they put in your mouth. That works a little bit better than the super glue and baking soda, but that's a classic trick. So, and this, for anyone who doesn't know, this is for if you have a nut slot that is ground too low. Rather than replace the whole part, you can actually just fill in the miscut slot and then recut it. So if you mix super glue and baking soda together, they'll form a hard resin that can be used basically as a filling, like you would fill a cavity. You can also use what we do, which is actual filling material. And then sometimes if all the nuts all the slots are low, you can remove the entire nut and actually shim it up too is another option. But the super glue and baking soda thing, we don't charge people money for it, but we do it for free as a like basic little fix, and it does seem to work fine. Very rarely do we ever see those come back, and it is something you can do on a plastic nut. One of the questions that came in before was asking about if you could get proper string movement and proper tuning on a plastic nut, or is bone required? No, absolutely not. Plastics have come a long way. It's a little degrading to call them plastics. Even the cheapest stuff we're seeing on the cheapest guitars now shouldn't stand in the way of you getting it set up properly. You may see a tonal improvement from changing the nut material, but there's no reason you shouldn't be able to get good performance out of any material.
Okay, Yana has a question. How do we fix sharp frets? Sharp frets are something that's a little tough, I think. It's beyond guitar maintenance 101. We're getting into fretwork, but I'll explain the process that we use. If we have a guitar with sharp frets sticking out, we have to grind down the metal without grinding down the wood, of course. So you use a long, let's go over to my toolbox. We use a fretwork stuff. So we use a long file like this. It's about 6 inches long, and this is used along the edges of the fingerboard, and we slide it along, and it has a really, really fine diamond grit on it. So we slide that along the edges of the fingerboard. It files down the metal, but it's a real technique thing. You have to watch when you're starting to hit the finish, you stop so that you don't burn through the finish. You only hit the metal, and you will inevitably, there's no way to take the wood down without hitting the finish a little bit. So there's sort of a few ways you can approach it. You can try and just take the finish off in a clean, uniform way and have a line. Or what I like to try and do is stop before I've actually gone through the finish, and then I can rebuff it and repolish, and you can't even tell. It depends how severe it is, depends on the design of the neck. But quite literally, we use a file, and we file it down on the end of the neck. Then you go in with a smaller file and clean up any burrs or anything like that. We have another question from Neil. Is it a good idea to loosen the strings maybe half a turn after playing a session or preparation for a couple weeks of storage? Nope. Keep your guitar tuned up at concert pitch at all times. Neck adjustment, right? It's a fight. It's 140 pounds from the strings, and then it's however much torque we've put on the truss rod to keep your neck in the right position, in the position we want it in. And remember, it's going to sit there, and it's going to go over the years, and it's slowly going to cure. And whatever position we leave it in, it's going to be more inclined to stay in that position. So if you take the tension off the strings but you don't loosen the truss rod, now your neck is going to be backbowed, right? Like if we take all the tension off the strings and no strings pulling it, but the rod is still forcing it back, it's going to be in backbow. If you leave it sitting that way, you may eventually one day go to tune up your guitar and find that the string tension is no longer enough to overcome the truss rod. So no, keep it tuned up to concert pitch. The only time I would tune my guitar down a little bit is if I'm going to ship it, or God help me put it under a plane or something like that, because that's, you know, only a few hours hopefully, or a very short period of time. And it does help it a little bit if you think there's a real risk of impact damage, particularly on that headstock, right? Because any force that hits the back of the headstock, it's not just that force that's going to break it, it's that force plus 140 pounds of string tension. So we can take that off, uncoil the spring a little bit, take a bit of natural tension out of the instrument, and gives it a little better chance of surviving an impact. But in terms of when you put your guitar away for the night, no, leave it strung up, leave it at concert pitch. It's the best thing for it. Detuning a guitar and leaving it in storage is a very bad idea. Jim asks a question. What is good maintenance advice for acoustic 12 string? Issues around bridge lifting. Some people tune them down half a step. Is that advisable? 12 strings are tough. They're not double the tension, but they're a lot more tension. There's a lot more holes drilled in them. Yeah, 12 strings are tough, but ultimately I think the same advice applies. If the bridge is lifting on the 12 string, it's probably a sign of hygroscopic change, or it could be something else going on. We need to get that fixed. If there's enough force in the string tension to pull that bridge off when it's tuned up and playing, tuning it down isn't going to save it. The bridge needs to be removed and re-glued securely, because you need to be able to tune it up in order to play it. And then when you play it, you're applying even more force to it as well. So it needs to be able to take the tension, not just of sitting there in tune, it needs to be able to take even more tension than that. So if you're seeing any kind of structural issues that arise from the guitar just being at concert pitch, those need to be addressed. And the same goes with 12-string necks. We don't want them spending any time sitting in the wrong position. The best way to clean a grimy fingerboard. So Bruce asks about this. Yeah. The best way to clean grimy fingerboards, I just use elbow grease and I scrub the heck out of them. You do see a lot of scraping that goes on, and I'm fine with that. I'm okay with technicians doing that. Some people use a standard razor blade blunted down and actually will scrape the wood on the fingerboard to get grime off. We're talking about when there's real buildup here, like real finger grime.
I like these little things. They're plastic razor blades. They sell them at Lee Valley. It's the only place I know of that sells them. If I do ever have a really scummy fingerboard, I'll scrape it with one of these, but generally speaking, I just don't like scraping fingerboard with a hard edge. I find lemon oil, which is a cleaner and conditioner for fingerboards, on paper towel, just straight up white paper towel, and just a ton of elbow grease. You can get it a little bit wet, let it soak a little bit, scrub it out. You can almost always get those things completely clean just with elbow grease and a little bit of lemon oil, I find. I've cleaned a lot of fingerboards in my day. One thing I do want to say about fingerboard oil, though, as much as I sometimes will use a fair bit of it to the point that it is almost like a standing liquid that you could splash in on the fingerboard, that's only for cleaning the dirtiest fingerboards, and the liquid is on and off the fingerboard almost instantly, within a few seconds. You never want to leave standing liquid. So when you use lemon oil, it should go on very light and it should be wiped dry with a paper towel. The fingerboard is going to absorb as much oil as it needs, but you don't want to introduce a lot of moisture. And by the way, general cleaning of fingerboards too, do keep them clean. Some people like, I got my mojo on there, like they like the way they feel when they're a little dirty, frankly. It'll rot your fingerboard, it'll get into the end grain around the fret slots, and you'll start getting loose frets. Don't leave your fingerboard dirty, clean it. At least whenever it starts looking gross, and giving it a wipe every time you clean the guitar is good. Cleaning the body. So there was some questions about cleaning the body. My best advice is only use a guitar cleaner or a guitar polish on guitars. A satin finish, a flat finish like this, use a satin guitar polish. Taylor makes one. They're the only company I'm aware of, at least that Long McQuade sells, that makes a satin guitar polish. But use that only, or a microfiber cloth, like a electronics cleaning or glasses cleaning cloth, or sold as a guitar polish cloth. Just this dry, or a satin guitar polish is the only thing you should use on a flat finish guitar. If you use other guitar cleaners on these that are meant for gloss finishes, sometimes it's not that common, it's fairly low risk, but you can get weird things going on. For a gloss finish like this, you can polish it with a microfiber cloth. That's generally going to take most grime out of it. You can use a guitar cleaner. There was a question about guitar cleaners with wax in them as well. Do you wax guitars? Do you use like turtle wax on them? That is done at a lot of factories. Martin and Taylor both use turtle wax, which is basically an automotive product, to put a coat of wax on their guitars where they go out. Wax, it stays on the guitar. It sits in the guitar's finish, and it is a protective coating. It puts nutrients back into the finish as well, too. Finishes, especially nitrocellulose finishes, do actually need nutrients to keep them moist and to keep them flexible over time. So long term, treating your guitar with a wax, a guitar polish product, there's a difference between polish and cleaner. A polish will usually have wax in it. Over the long term, you're going to get a glossier finish, it's going to be more flexible, it's less likely to check, it's less likely to crack. It also means it isn't going to patina. So if you like the look of old guitars, using a constant wax is going to keep it looking a lot more modern. Also, too, the wax does keep the finish softer, so it's gummier. It gets dirtier. It requires more cleaning. So waxing your guitar does make it possible for you to have like a pristine, beautiful showroom finish all the time, but over time it is actually more work. Certainly the easiest, simplest thing is to just use a guitar cleaner. Most guitar polishes have a little bit of wax in them, that's okay. Just keep it clean and accept that over time, just the movement, the use of the guitar, you're going to start to see the finish do some weird things. Like a good example on this J45 is that the side where I'll see if I can kind of get it in the light there, the side where where your arm would rub starts to actually get sort of dulled in a way that, you could buff that out, but ultimately that's just the softness of the finish starting to patina. It's not unusual. There was a quick question about pickup heights, if I could touch on pickup heights. When you're for electric guitars, this is something, there's a really great video that, who put that out? Was that, I think it was Lace Sensor put that out. Regardless, at the end of the day, pickup height is largely a matter of sound. You want them close. You can really control the balance and the behavior of your strings with pickup height, so it is a bit of a personal taste thing. Most of them are very easy to adjust with a Phillips head, so you can play the guitar and adjust the pickup as you go. Fender, in their spec sheet, as I said, does publish recommended pickup heights, but they're very clear. This is a personal taste thing for how it sounds. The one thing you do want to avoid, though, is getting the pickup too close to the string because it can pull the string. The magnetic pull of the same way, the magnet in the pickup is sensing the string, but it's also a magnet that's pulling the string down. So sometimes we can get guitars where it seems like everything's set up great, the action's where it should be, the relief's fine, the neck's straight, there's no high fret. Why is this thing buzzing? It's getting fret buzz. Sometimes it's the pickup is so close to the string that it's pulling the string down. So when it vibrates, it's yanking it down towards the frets. And sometimes string buzz can be actually alleviated by lowering the pickups, especially on pickups with really strong magnets. It's something to try. If you have one of those ghost in the machine things, the guitar's buzzing, we just can't figure it out, maybe try dropping the pickups and just see, because they are pulling the strings down, right? The other thing too is if, also too, and the other thing you'll notice if you're doing that is the sound will get a real like kind of warbly sound to it. It will start making it sound strange. I've got a question here from Brian. I use baby oil on the fingerboard, which a luthier taught me to use back in the 80s. Your thoughts? Where's the Fender guide posted or available? The Fender specs, where's that available on the public internet? It might be somewhere on their website. I, of course, get it through Fender's dealer network. If I can, I'll follow up on that. Matt can make a note. If I can't find it online, we'll post it. We'll post it somewhere, and they'll have to deal with me giving it out. But yeah, it's just Fender standard setup specs is the name of the document they put out, and that they refresh occasionally when they get new models. So back to Brian's question though. Yeah, baby oil. I'm not 100% sure on baby oil. Most fingerboard oils are boiled linseed oil. That's what they are. You can buy it in a big jug from the hardware store. Boiled linseed oil. Generally speaking, it's the oils in your fingers, is what we've historically always relied on. Like I said, back when you had, a guitar where a fingerboard was dried for 100 years, this wasn't something we need to worry about too much. The idea of moistening and hydrating the fingerboard is sort of a factor of, the wood's a little less cured now, and we do need to make sure it stays hydrated. So lemon oil, boiled linseed oil is fine. I'm honestly not certain about baby oil. I'm going to expect that actually may be okay. But the main thing is just to make, I wonder what's in there, if there's perfumes or other things that are unnecessary in there. But it's probably unlikely it's going to really do any damage. It's not going to have a solvent in it, right? But the main thing is just wiping it off and not leaving excess. You're not letting it soak in. This isn't like oiling a cutting board, if you've ever done that, where you really load it up and let it sit overnight and wipe off the excess. No. This is a quick process. And the other thing too is, with oiling fingerboards, it's kind of the most satisfying thing to do. The fingerboard looks great, you clean it up, and it's something you can really do or you feel like you're helping. Guitars don't really need it that often. Generally speaking, I think if you buy a new guitar that has a ebony fingerboard, you should hydrate it once a year for the first 5 years, and then it's probably good forever, is the truth. Rosewood fingerboard, let's say twice a year for the first 10 years, and then it's probably good forever. I would never discourage anyone from hydrating their fingerboard. You're unlikely to overhydrate it, but the truth is, as the wood, the oil doesn't go anywhere. It just keeps penetrating into the wood, and very quickly you get to a point where it's just not necessary constantly. You do not need to do this every time you finish a guitar. I think, yeah, this is the bottle of lemon oil I brought. This is my own personal property from probably 15 years ago of guitar ownership, and that's where we're at. I decided to bring that from home rather than one of the, we go through them in the shop obviously, but me, my own personal guitar collection, my life as a musician, I probably bought this 15 years ago, and there's still like a solid third or a quarter left. So this is not something you need to do constantly. What about Windex on a finish? That is probably fine on a more modern finish. I would avoid a nitrocellulose finish, which is what you're going to get on a Gibson guitar or most Martin guitars, but on a modern finish, Windex is probably okay, but again, wipe off very quickly. Pledge, Lysol, yes, we had some conversations about disinfecting guitars recently, as you can imagine. The long and short of it is that I don't think there's any way to safely disinfect a guitar completely without risking damage to the guitar. Modern non-nitrocellulose finishes in most cases are probably fine. What all imported guitars, what Taylor uses, they're very hard, they're very resilient. You can wipe them down with Lysol, disinfect them that way, and you're probably fine. You cannot get it anywhere near the open wood, and you cannot allow it to seep anywhere into a glue seam. It has solvents in it, no good. My general advice is I just think we can't really use solvents, strong solvents on guitars to the point where we could safely disinfect them. the best advice I can give is only use a guitar product on a guitar, ultimately. Silicone is something you want to avoid too. Most guitar polishes are advertised as being silicone free. Silicone basically makes glue not stick. It's less of an issue. It's less of an issue on a brand new guitar. We talk about turtle waxing a brand new guitar. That's generally fine. It's once the guitar gets older, if there's any separations in the finish, if there's anywhere it could get into where it gets to the wood, silicone becomes a big problem. And once it's in the wood, you can never get it out. So you generally want to avoid silicone as well. Okay, now I have a question from Steve. I have a buzz when plugged in, even a feedback sound. Is this an electronic issue? Okay, I'm not sure. That depends a little bit what kind of guitar you have. I'll show you a quick, one thing I did kind of prepare, just I want to make clear. And Steve, do tell me, like, if you have an acoustic guitar and electric, a little more detail, I might be able to answer you better. And while we're waiting for you on that, I'll just quickly, this may pop here when we plug it in because we're using a very old amp. Some noises are normal. Yeah, this is my example of a guitar with problems. That's not a very normal one, eh? All right, there we go. So despite the output jack problems, all right, so I'm going to really wind this out. I don't know if you'll be able to hear it. So, buzz, no buzz. Buzz, no buzz. This is a single coil instrument. You can hear how when I have it all the way forward, just on the neck pickup, we have this buzz. When I bring it into this position, the buzz goes away. That's because these two pickups are working together. They're acting as a humbucker. I bring it to the middle position where it's just this pickup, it buzzes again. This is the nature of single coil pickups. This is the hum that humbuckers buck. So if you have a Les Paul, if you have anything with dual coil pickups, this is going to be avoidable. But if you have a single coil guitar, like a Stratocaster, the single pickups on their own are going to buzz like that. Only when you pair them as a humbucker should it go away. So if you're noticing, my guitar seems to buzz, if it's a single coil setup like this, just check, does it buzz all the time or does it only buzz on the independent single pickups by themselves? If you're getting what we're getting here, where it buzzes by itself, but the paired pickups don't buzz, that is normal, and you're just going to have to find a way to live with the single coil sound. That is the main ways you mitigate single coil hum. 60 cycle hum is from radio interference in the air. You can do some stuff with shielding, you can do things with better cables. Just positioning the guitar almost goes away there because I'm not, but as I turn it, it's just radio interference. There's little you can do about it. There are some things you can do to help it, but it's pretty much impossible to completely eliminate it in all situations. So 60 cycle hum. Oh, vintage banjo question from Michael O'Coin. Any peculiarities about looking after a vintage banjo? Yep, many. Yeah, geez, that could be its own video. Yeah, you know, banjos, the banjo world's interesting. Most banjo players do learn to work on their own gear and tend to be a little bit kind of more like motorcycle drivers, where they sort of work on their own stuff a little more than the average car owner maybe. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of peculiarities. The banjo is an extremely unstandardized instrument compared to the guitar. So it's very tough without knowing what you're dealing with. Coordinator rods are an absolutely beautiful system for how they adjust, but most vintage banjos don't have them. And the truth is, a lot of vintage banjos basically are only adjusted through real woodworking, actually changing the structure of the instrument.
I would seek out a banjo expert that you really trust and someone that feels comfortable with it. Most guitar techs will very happily decline to be your banjo expert if they don't know what they're talking about. So find somebody who's enthusiastic to be your banjo expert, and you'll be in good hands. We could get more specific, but I'd need to know what you're dealing with. They're just all so different. We have a question from Don. Is there a way to fix a slightly warped neck where no further truss rod adjustment seems to help? Yeah, so at a certain point, you can back bow it, you can forward bow it, but it doesn't, no matter what, it's just not even. It's a little bit wavy. This is where we get into, it really depends how bad it is. This is where fret leveling comes in, whether you do it by hand or whether it's done with a machine like the Plek machine. It's going to scan the fingerboard surface. It's going to, or if you're doing it by hand, you're basically going to reestablish a flat surface by actually grinding down some of the frets. So if you have a fingerboard that is not even, that goes like this rather than being straight, we can come in with a file and we can actually file off the tops of those high frets and bring everything down to be level again. But this only works if it's a really small difference. We can't take very much off of a fret before we're down to the fingerboard. So very minor cases, a fret level, it's about a $150 thing. I think if you want it done with the Plek machine, it's about $25 more. But we can reestablish a flat surface that will help with a basic, very minor amount of warping, which honestly happens on most guitars over the long term. Eventually, guitars are all going to need some fret work. If it's really severe, we may have to rip all the frets out, that is, carefully extract all the frets, and then sand the fingerboard flat again, actually sand the wood flat and then refret. Sometimes even that's too extreme though. The wood is so warped that even the thickness of the fingerboard, you could take it all the way down. There is heat pressing. There are other things we can do where we can actually heat the neck and try and bend it back straight. This is a somewhat more dubious procedure. We do it, but it's a real no guarantees kind of thing. It's very challenging. You can't do it on all guitars because the heat will melt certain plastics and stuff, but there is hope. If you have got a really warped neck, let's certainly talk about it, but you're getting into more expert stuff there. I mean, geez, there was a great article in one of the Guild Blue 3 magazines where a guy had an old bass neck that was warped, and he just as an experiment, he clamped it to a dead straight beam and then put it in the back window of his car for like a month. He lived in Arizona, and so it slowly heated up with humidity while it was clamped straight. Then he took it out and strung it up, and lo and behold, the thing was straight again. So who knows? I mean, really, we're talking about a piece of wood under incredible stress with huge demands on it, like tolerances down to thousandths of an inch, and we're talking about trying to just keep it deadly straight as an arrow over the course of many decades or maybe centuries. So it's pretty wild how well necks actually can hold up. I will say too, if you're talking about an electric guitar with a bolt-on neck, consider replacing the neck. Fender, after many years of refusing to do so, now actually sells replacement necks for almost all of their guitars. You can just buy them, and they're not that expensive. And so in most cases, we refret very, very few Mexican Fender necks now because it is significantly cheaper to just buy a brand new neck than it is to refret an old one. So that's worth looking into. Marty asks, curious about string height at the nut first fret on an electric guitar. Yes, okay, so generally, string height at the nut is measured off the first fret. Usually somewhere in the area of 20 thousandths is fairly typical. 22 thousandths is pretty common. 18 thousandths is common. Some people like to go really, really skinny. So if I take my 20 thousandths feeler gauge and make sure I don't knock anything over, and then at the first fret, just feeling between the top of the fret and the string, we can check the height that way and actually measure it if you want to do it like a machinist. This is in that Fender specs thing. Generally, anything under 20,000 I think is safe. Anything under 16 thousandths is very worrisome, but it depends. It kind of goes back to that triangle of the setup. If you play very lightly, you can get away with it being a little bit lower. So that's a factor. If you play with, there's other things you can do as well too. One like real quick like tip way to check string height too is just press the string down at the 3rd fret, and you should see a little bit of clearance. So if you press it down at the 3rd fret, you should see that little bit of movement. The string can still move. It has a little clearance above the fret.
you want to make sure that there's clearance. If you press it down at the 3rd fret and it has no room to move, it's just sitting on that 1st fret pinned down, then the nut slot is probably too low. So that's the easiest way to check nut slot height. All right, cool. Oh my gosh, so many questions, so many untouched things. I'll have to just do one of these every week. This has been great. Really good questions. Everyone, thanks for hanging on. Those of you that are still there, this has been a total marathon, but I've really enjoyed it. As you can tell, I love talking about guitars, and I could talk about them all day. If there are any more questions that pop up, I guess leave them in the comments or somewhere. Just ask them, and Matt will get them back to me, and we'll get them answered. I always feel really good after we do one of these because I know people have got the information that they actually need, and that's what we're all here for. I'm lucky enough to do a job where my job is to make sure everybody's happy with their guitars, and normally I do that behind the workbench, actually fixing them, but that hasn't been happening as much lately. But I hope this has been helpful for everybody and help a few more people, if not solve their own problems, at least understand what's going on a little more. So I'll sign off just by encouraging people once more to dive in and try this stuff. You know, it's not rocket science. It is a craft. It's challenging, but it is 100% learnable. Most of the people doing this work professionally were either self-taught or they were taught in a school by somebody who is self-taught. There's more resources out there than ever. There's never been a better time to learn how to do this stuff, so dive in. That's all for me. It is time to get some dinner. Once more, I'm Mike Robichaux for Long McQuade. Thanks for watching.
Long and McQuade, where the music begins.